I'm afraid this is on a cash-bar basis, I said, putting the glass on the table and preparing to open the can.
What does that mean?
Things from the bar are extra, not included in the fare.
How ridiculous! And I haven't any money.
Well, you could pay later, I'm sure.
I think it's stupid.
I opened the can and poured the Coke, and Mrs. Young, who happened to be sitting alone at the next table, turned round and said to Xanthi sweetly that she, Mrs. Young, would pay for the Coke. And wouldn't Xanthi come and join her? Xanthi's first instinct was clearly to refuse, but, sulky or not, she was also lonely, and there was an undemanding grandmotherliness about Mrs. Young that promised an uncritical listening ear. Xanthi moved herself and her Coke and unburdened herself of her immediate thought.
That brother of mine, she said, is an asshole. Perhaps he has his problems, Mrs. Young said equably, digging around in her capacious and disorganized handbag for some money. If he wasn't anyone else's kid, he'd be in jail. The words came out as if propelled irresistibly from a well of compressed emotion. Even Xanthi herself looked shocked at what she'd let out, and feebly tried to weaken the impact. I didn't mean literally, of course, she said. But she had. Mrs. Young, who had paused in her search, finally found her purse and gave me $1. If there's any change, keep it, she said. Thank you, madam. I had no choice but to leave, and I made for the kitchen carrying the $1 on the tray like a trophy anchored by a thumb. From there I looked back to see Xanthi begin to talk to Mrs. Young, at first slowly, with brakes on, and then faster and faster, until all the unhappiness was pouring out like a flood. I could see Xanthi's face and the back of Mrs. Young's head. Xanthi, it seemed to me, was perhaps 16, but probably younger, certainly not older. She still had the facial contours of childhood, with a round chin and big pupilled eyes. Also chestnut hair in abundance, and a growing figure hidden within a bulky white top, with a pink, glittering pop slogan on the front, the badge of youth. They were still talking when I continued on my way back to my roomette, where I sat in comfortable privacy for a while reading the timetable, and also reflecting that although I still had no answers to the old questions, I now had a whole crop of new ones, the most urgent being whether or not Filmer had already known the Youngs were friends of Ezra Gideon, whether the Youngs were, in fact, a target of some kind. Yet Filmer hadn't chosen to sit at their table. It had been the random, fortuitous decision of Daffodil. Perhaps if it hadn't happened so handily by chance, he would have engineered a meeting. Or was the fact of their friendship with Gideon just an unwelcome coincidence, as I had at first supposed? Time, perhaps, would tell. Time told me more immediately that it was 5:30, the hour of return to the dining-room, and I returned to find every single seat already taken, the passengers having learnt fast. Latecomers stood in the entrances, looking forlorn. Filmer, I saw at once, was placed opposite Mercer Lorrimore. Daffodil, beside him, was opposite Bambi, who was being coolly gracious. Xanthi was still sitting across from Mrs. Young, now rejoined by her husband. Sheridan, as far as I could see, was absent. Giles the murderer was present, sitting with the Youngs and Xanthi, being nice. Emile, Oliver, Cathy, and I went round the tables, pouring wine, tea, or coffee into glasses or cups on small trays, with small movements. And when that was done, Zack bounded into the midst of things, vibrating with fresh energy to get on with the mystery. I didn't listen in detail to it all, but it revolved around Pierre and Donna, and Raoul, the racehorse trainer, who wanted to marry her money. Zack had got round the preempted Pierre hitting Raoul to the ground routine by having Donna slap Raoul's face instead, which she did with a gusto that brought gasps from the audience. Donna was clearly established as the Wittering Bricknell's besotted daughter, with Raoul obviously Mavis's favourite, and Pierre despised as a no-good compulsive gambler. Mother and daughter went into a sharp slanging match, with Walter fussing and trying to stop them. Mavis, in the end, started crying. I looked at the passengers' faces. Even though they knew this lot were all actors, they were transfixed.
Soap opera had come to life within touching distance. Racing people, I'd always thought, were among the most cynical in the world, yet here some of the most experienced of them were moved and involved despite themselves. Zack, keeping up the tension, said that at the last of our brief stops at minor stations he had been handed a telex about Angelica's missing friend Steve. Was Angelica present? Everyone looked around, and no, she wasn't. Never mind, Zack said. Would someone please tell her that she must telephone Steve from Sudbury, as he had serious news for her? A lot of people nodded. It was amazing. Dressed in silk and ablaze with jewellery, apparently to prove that Donna's inheritance was no myth, Mavis Bricknell stumbled off towards the toilet room at the dome car's entrance, saying she must repair the ravages to her face. And presently she came back, screaming loudly. Angelica, it appeared, was lying on the lavatory floor, extremely dead. Zack naturally bustled to investigate, followed by a sizable section of the audience. Some of them soon came back, smiling weakly and looking unsettled. "Oh, she can't really be dead," someone said solemnly. "But she certainly looks it." There was a lot of blood all over the small compartment, it appeared, with Angelica's battered head in shadow beyond the essential facility. Angelica's eyes were just visible, staring at the wall, unblinking. "How can she do that?" several said. Zack came back, looked around him, and beckoned to me. "Stand in front of that door, will you, and don't let anyone go in." I nodded and went through the crowd towards the dome car. Zack himself was calling everyone back into the dining room, saying they should all stay together until we reached Sudbury, which would be soon. I could hear Nell's voice announcing calmly that everyone had time for another drink. There would be an hour's stop in Sudbury for everyone to stretch their legs if they wanted to, and dinner would be served as soon as the train started again. I went across the clattering, windy linkage space between the dining and dome cars and stood outside the toilet room. I wasn't actually pleased with Zack, as I didn't want to risk being identified as an actor, but that, I supposed, would be a great deal better than the truth. It was boring in the passage, but also it proved necessary, as one or two passengers came back for a look at the corpse. They were good-humoured enough when turned away. Meanwhile, the corpse, who must have had to blink in the end, could be heard flushing water within. When we began to slow down, I knocked on the door. "Message from Zack," I said. The door opened a fraction. Angelica's grease-paint makeup was a pale bluish grey, her hair a mass of tomato ketchup. "Lock the door," I said. "Zack'll be along. When you hear his voice outside, unlock it." "Right," she said, sounding cheerfully alive. "Have a nice trip." Chapter 8. Angelica left the train on a stretcher in the dusk under bright station lights, her tomato head half covered by a blanket, and one lifeless hand with red fingernails and sparkling rings artistically drooping out of concealment on the side where the train's passengers were able to look on with fascination. I watched the scene through the window of George Burley's office while I talked to Bill Baudelaire's mother on the telephone. The conversation had been a surprise from the beginning, when a light, young female voice had answered my call. "Could I speak to Mrs. Baudelaire, please?" I said. "Speaking." I mean Mrs. Baudelaire Senior." "Any Mrs. Baudelaire who is senior to me is in her grave," she announced. "Who are you?" "Tor Kelsey." "Oh, yes," she replied instantly. "The Invisible Man." I half laughed. "How do you do it?" she asked. "I'm dying to know." "Seriously?" "Of course, seriously." "Well, say if someone serves you fairly often in a shop. You recognize them when you're in the shop, but if you meet them somewhere quite different, like at the races, you can't remember who they are." "Quite right. It's happened to me often." "To be easily recognized," I said, "you have to be in your usual environment. So the trick about invisibility is not to have a usual environment." There was a pause, and then she said, "Thank you." "It must be lonely." I couldn't think of an answer to that, but was astounded by her perception. "Well, the interesting thing is," I said, "that it's quite different for the people who work in the shop. When they get to know their customers, they recognize them easily anywhere in the world. But when they get to know their customers, So the racing people I know, I recognize everywhere. They don't know that I exist. And that's invisibility.
"You are," she said, "an extraordinary young man."
She stumped me again.
"But Bill knew you existed," she said, "and he told me he didn't recognize you face to face."
He was looking for the environment he knew. Straight hair, no sunglasses, a good grey suit, collar and tie.
"Yes," she said. "If I meet you, will I know you?"
"I'll tell you."
"Packed."
This, I thought, with relief and enjoyment, was some carrier pigeon. "Would you give Bill some messages?" I asked.
"Fire away, I'll write them down."
"The train reaches Winnipeg tomorrow evening at about 7:30, and everyone disembarks to go to hotels. Please, would you tell Bill I will not be staying at the same hotel as the owners, and that I will again not be going to the President's lunch, but that I will be at the races, even if he doesn't see me." I paused. She repeated what I'd said. "Great," I said. "And would you ask him some questions?"
"Fire away."
"Ask him for general information on a Mr. and Mrs. Young who own a horse called Sparrowgrass."
"It's on the train," she said.
"Yes, that's right." I was surprised, but she said Bill had given her a list to be a help with messages. "Ask him," I said, "if Sheridan Lorrimore has ever been in any trouble that he knows of, apart from assaulting an actor at Toronto that should have resulted in Sheridan going to jail."
"Gracious me! The Lorrimores don't go to jail."
"So I gathered," I said dryly. "And would you also ask which horses are running at Winnipeg and which at Vancouver, and which, in Bill's opinion, is the really best horse on the train, not necessarily on form, and which has the best chance of winning either race?"
"I don't need to ask Bill the first question. I can answer that for you right away. It's on this list. Nearly all the 11 horses, 9 to be exact, are running at Vancouver. Only Upper Gumtree and Flocati run at Winnipeg. As for the second, in my opinion, neither Upper Gumtree nor Flocati will win at Winnipeg, because Mercer Lorrimore is shipping his great horse Premier by horse van."
"Ah," I said. "You follow racing quite a bit."
"My dear young man, didn't Bill tell you? His father and I owned and ran the Ontario Raceworld magazine for years before we sold it to a conglomerate."
"I see," I said faintly.
"And as for the Vancouver race," she went on blithely, "Laurentide ice might as well melt right now. But Sparrowgrass and Voting Right are both in with a good chance. Sparrowgrass will probably start favourite, as his form is consistently good. But, as you ask, very likely the best horse, the one with the most potential for the future, is Mercer Lorrimore's Voting Right, and I would give that one the edge."
"Mrs. Baudelaire," I said, "you are a gem."
"Beyond the price of rubies," she agreed. "Anything else?"
"Nothing, except I hope you're well."
"No, not very. You're kind to ask. Goodbye, young man. I'm always here."
She put the receiver down quickly, as if to stop me from asking anything else about her illness, and it reminded me sharply of my Aunt Viv, bright, spirited, and horse-mad to the end. I went back to the dining car to find Oliver and Cathy laying the tables for dinner, and I helped them automatically, although they said I needn't. The job done, we repaired to the kitchen door to see literally what was cooking, and to take the printed menus from Angus to put on the tables. Blinis with caviar, we read, followed by rack of lamb or cold poached salmon, then chocolate mousse with cream.
"There won't be any over,"
Cathy sighed, and she was right as far as the blinis went, though we all ate lamb in the end. With ovens and gas burners roaring away, it was wiltingly hot, even at the dining-room end of the kitchen. Down where the chef worked, a temperature gauge on the wall stood at 102 degrees Fahrenheit, but tall, willowy Angus, whose high hat nearly brushed the ceiling, looked cool and unperturbed.
"Don't you have air conditioning?" I asked.
Angus said, "In summer, I dare say. October is, however, officially winter, even though it's been warm this year. The air conditioning needs Freon gas, which is all leaked away, and it won't be topped up again until spring, so Simone tells me." Simone, a good foot shorter, and with sweat trickling down her temples, mutely nodded. The passengers came straggling back, shedding overcoats, and saying it was cold outside, and again the dining car filled up. The Lorrimores this time were all sitting together. The Youngs were with the Unwins from Australia, and Filmer and Daffodil shared a table with a pair Nell later identified to me as the American owners of the horse called Flocati. Filmer, extremely smooth in a dark suit and grey tie, solicitously removed Daffodil's chinchillas and hung them over the back of her chair. She shimmered in a figure-hugging black dress, diamonds sparkling whenever she moved, easily outstripping the rest of the company, even Mavis Bricknell, in conspicuous expenditure. The train made its smooth, inconspicuous departure, and I did my stuff with water and breadsticks. Bambi Lorrimore put her hand arrestingly on my arm as I passed. She was wearing a mink jacket and struggling to get out of it. "Take this back into our private car, will you?" she said. "It's too hot in here. Put it in the saloon, not the bedroom." "Certainly, madam," I agreed, helping her with alacrity. "I'd be glad to." Mercer produced a key and gave it to me, explaining that I would come to a locked door. "Lock it again when you come back." "Yes, sir." He nodded, and carrying the coat away over my arm, I went back through the dome car and with a great deal of interest into the private quarters of the Lorrimores. There were lights on everywhere. I came first to a small, unoccupied sleeping space, then a galley, cold and lifeless. Provision for private food and private crew, but no food, no crew. Beyond that was the locked door, and beyond that a small, handsome dining room to seat 8. Through there, down a corridor, there were 3 bedrooms, 2 with the doors open. I took a quick peek inside. Bed, drawers, small bathroom with shower. One was clearly Xanthi's, the other, by inference, Sheridan's. I didn't go into the parents' room, but went on beyond it to find myself in the rear part of the carriage, at the very end of the train. It was a comfortable drawing-room with a television set, and abundant upholstered armchairs in pastel blues and greens. I went over to the rear door and looked out, seeing a little open boarding platform with a polished brass-topped balustrade, and beyond, the Canadian Pacific's single pair of rails streaming away into darkness. The railroad across Canada, I'd learnt, was single-track for most of the way. Only in towns, and at a few other places, could trains going in opposite directions pass. I put the mink coat on a chair and retraced my journey, locking the door again and eventually returning the key to Mercer, who nodded without speech and put it in his pocket. Emile was pouring wine. The passengers were scoffing the beanies. I eased into the general picture again and became as unidentifiable as possible. Few people, I discovered, looked directly at a waiter's eyes, even when they were talking to him. About an hour after we'd left Sudbury, we stopped briefly for under 5 minutes at a place called Cartier, and then went on again. The passengers, replete with the lamb and chocolate mousse, lingered over coffee, and began to drift away to the dome car's bar lounge. Xanthi Lorrimore got up from the table after a while, and went that way, and presently came back, screaming. This time, the real thing. She came stumbling back into the dining car, followed by a commotion of people yelling behind her. She reached her parents, who were bewildered as well as worried. "I was nearly killed," she said frantically. "I nearly stepped off into space. I was nearly killed." "Darling," Mercer said calmingly, "what has exactly happened?"
You don't understand,"
She was screaming, trembling, hysterical.
I nearly stepped into space because our private car isn't there."
It brought both of the Lorrimores to their feet in an incredulous rush, but they had only to look at the faces crowding behind her to know it was true.
And they say, all those people say—"
She was gasping, half unable to get the words out, terribly frightened.
"They say the other train, the regular Canadian, is only half an hour behind us, and we'll smash into... We'll smash into... Don't you see?"
The Lorrimores, followed by everyone still in the dining room, went dashing off into the dome car. But Emile and I looked at each other, and I said, "How do we warn that train?" "Tell the conductor. He has a radio." "I'll go," I said. "I know where his office is. I'll find him. Hurry, then. Yes. I hurried, ran, reached George's office. No one there. I went on, running where I could, and found him walking back towards me through the day-nighter. He instantly took in that I brought bad news and steered me at once into the noisy outside coupling space between the day-nighter and the central dining car. "What is it?" he shouted. "The Lorrimores' private car is unhitched. It's somewhere back on the track, and the Canadian is coming." He moved faster than I would have thought anyone could on a train, and was already talking into a radio headset when I reached his office. "The private car was there at Cartier," he said. "I was off the train there, and I saw it. Are you sure it's not in sight?" He listened. "Right. Then radio to the Canadian and warn the conductor he'll not be leaving Cartier, eh? I'll get this train stopped and we'll go back for the lost car. See what's what. You'd better inform Toronto and Montreal. They won't think this is very funny on a Sunday evening, eh?" He chuckled and looked at me assessingly as I stood in the doorway. "I'll leave someone here manning the radio," he continued. "Tell him when you've got the Canadian understanding the situation, eh?" He nodded at the reply he heard, took off the headset, and gave it to me. "You're talking to the dispatcher in Schreiber," he said. "That's ahead of us, this side of Thunder Bay, and he can radio straight to the Canadian following us. You can hear the dispatcher without doing anything. To transmit, press the button." He pointed and was gone. I put on the headset and sat in his chair, and presently into my ears a disembodied voice said, "Are you there?" I pressed the button. "Yes." "Tell George I got the Canadian, and it'll stop in Cartier. There's a CP freight train due behind it, but I got Sudbury in time, and it isn't leaving there. No one is happy. Tell George to pick up that car and get the hell out." I pressed the button. "Right," I said. "Who are you?" asked the voice. "One of the attendants." She said, "Huh," and was quiet. The great transcontinental mystery race train began to slow down and soon came to a smooth stop. Almost in the same instant, George was back in his doorway. "Tell the dispatcher we've stopped and are going back," he said, when I'd relayed the messages. "We're 11.2 miles out of Cartier, between Benny and Stralach, which means in an uninhabited wilderness. You stay here, eh?" And he was gone again, this time towards the excitement in the tale. I gave his message to the dispatcher and added, "We're reversing now, going slowly. Let me know when you find the car." "Yes." It was pitch dark through the windows, no light in the wilderness. I heard afterwards from a lot of excited chattering in the dining-room that George had stood alone outside the rear door of the dome car on the brink of space, directing a bright hand-held torch beam down the track. Heard that he had a walkie-talkie radio on which he could give the engineer instructions to slow down further and to stop. He found the Lorrimores' car about 1.5 miles out of Cartier. The whole train stopped while he jumped down from the dome car and went to look at the laggard. There was a long pause, from my point of view, while the lights began flickering in the office, and the train exceedingly slowly reversed, before stopping again and going into a sudden jerk. Then we started forward slowly, and then faster, and the lights stopped flickering, and soon after that George appeared in his office looking grim, all chuckles extinguished. "What's the matter?" I said. "Nothing," he said violently. "That's what's the matter." He stretched out a hand for the headset, which I gave him. He spoke into it. "This is George. We picked up the Lorrimores' car at 1.3 miles west of Cartier. There was no failure in the linkage." He listened. "That's what I said. Who the hell do they have working in Cartier, eh? Someone uncoupled that car at Cartier and rigged some way of pulling it out of the station into the darkness before releasing it. The brakes weren't on. You tell Cartier to send someone right away down the track, looking for a rope or some such, eh? The steam heat pipe wasn't broken, it had been unlocked." "That's what I said. The valve was closed." "It was no goddamn accident, no goddamn mechanical failure. Someone deliberately unhitched that car. If the Lorrimore girl hadn't found out, the Canadian would have crashed into it. No, maybe not at high speed, but at 25, 30 miles an hour, the Canadian can do a lot of damage. Would have made matchsticks of the private car. Might have killed the Canadian engineers, or even derailed the train. You tell them to start looking, eh? He took off the headset and stared at me with rage. Would you, he said, know how to uncouple one car from another? No, of course not. It takes a railway man. He glared. A railway man. It's like a mechanic letting someone drive off in a car with loose wheel nuts. It's criminal, eh? Yes. 100 years ago, he said furiously, they designed a system to prevent cars that had broken loose from running backwards and crashing into things. The brakes go on automatically in a runaway. He glared. That system had been bypassed. The Lorimor's brakes weren't on. That car was deliberately released on level ground, eh? I don't understand it. What was the point? Maybe someone doesn't like the Lorimors, I suggested. We'll find the bastard, he said, not listening. There can't be many in Cartier who know trains. Do you get much sabotage? I asked. Not like this. Not often. Once or twice in the past, but it's mostly vandals. A kid or two throwing rocks off a bridge. Some stealing, eh? He was affronted, I saw, by the treachery of one of his own kind. He took it personally. He was, in a way, ashamed, as one is if one's countrymen behave badly abroad. I asked him about his communication system with the engineer. Why had he gone up the train himself to get it stopped, if he had a walkie-talkie? It crackles if we're going at any speed. It's better to talk face to face. A light flashed on the ship-to-shore radio, and he replaced his headset. George here, he said, and listened. He looked at his watch and frowned. Yes, right. Understood. He took off the headset, shaking his head. They're not going to go along the track looking for a rope until both the Canadian and the freight train have been through. If our saboteurs got an ounce of sense by that time, there won't be anything incriminating to find. Probably not already, I said. It's getting on for an hour since we left Cartier. Yeah, he said. His good humour was trickling back despite his anger, the gleam of irony again in his eye. Better than that fellow's fake mystery, eh? Yes, I said, thinking. Is the steam pipe the only thing connecting one car to the next? Except the links, of course. That's right. What about electricity and water? He shook his head. Each car makes its own electricity, self-contained. They have generators under the floors, like dynamos on bicycles, that make electricity from the wheels going round. The problem is that when we're going slowly, the lights flicker. Then there are batteries for when we're stopped, but they'd only last for 45 minutes, if we weren't plugged into the ground supply at a station. After that, we're down to emergency lighting, just the aisle lights, and not much else for about 4 hours. Then we're in the dark. And water? I asked. It's in the roof. Really? I said, surprised. He patiently explained. At city stations, we have water hydrants every 85 feet, the length of the cars, one to each car. Also, the main electricity, same thing, eh? Anyway, the water goes up under pressure into the tanks in the roof and feeds down again to the washrooms by gravity. Fascinating, I thought. And it had made unhitching the Lorimor's car a comparatively quick and easy job. The new cars, George said, will be heated by electricity, not steam. So we'll be doing away with the steam pipe, eh? And they'll have tanks for the sewage, which now drops straight down onto the tracks, of course. Canada's railways, I said politely, will be the envy of the world. He chuckled. The trains between Montreal and Toronto are late 3/4 of the time, and the new engines break down regularly. The old rolling stock like this train is great. He picked up the headset again. I raised a hand in farewell and went back to the dining room, where the real mystery had easily usurped Zach's, though some were sure it was part of the plot. Xanthi had cheered up remarkably through being the centre of sympathetic attention, and Filmer was telling Mercer Lorimor he should sue the railway company for millions of dollars for negligence. The near disaster had galvanized the general consciousness to a higher adrenaline level, probably because Xanthi had not, in fact, been carried off like Angelica. Nell was sitting at a table with a 40-ish couple, who she later told me owned one of the horses in the boxcar, a dark bay called Ready Hot. The man beckoned to me as I stood around vaguely, and asked me to fetch cognac for him, vodka with ice for his wife, and what for Nell. "Just Coke, please," she said. I went to the kitchen where I knew the Coke was, but made frantic question-mark signals to Nell about the rest. Emile, the chefs Oliver and Cathy, had finished cleaning up and had all gone off duty. I had no alcohol divining rod to bend a twig in the direction of brandy or Smirnoff. Nell said something to the owners and came to join me, stifling laughter. "Oh, yes, very funny," I said. "But what the hell do I do?" "Take one of the small trays and get the drinks from the bar. I'll explain they have to pay for them." "I haven't seen you for 5 minutes alone today," I complained. "You're downstairs. I'm up." "I could easily hate you." "But do you?" "Not yet," I said. "If you're a good little waiter, I'll leave you a tip." She went back to her place with a complacent bounce to her step, and with a curse, but not meaning it. I took the Coke and a glass to her table, and went on into the dome car for the rest. After I'd returned and delivered the order, someone else asked for the same service, which I willingly performed again, and yet again. On each trip I overheard snatches of the barroom conversations, and could hear the louder buzz of continuing upheaval along in the lounge. And I thought that after I'd satisfied everyone in the dining room, I might drift along to the far end with my disarming little tray. The only person not wholly in sympathy with this plan was the bartender, who complained that I was supposed to be off duty, and that the passengers should come to the bar to buy the drinks themselves. I was siphoning off his tips. I saw the justice of that, and offered to split 50-50. He knew very well that without my running to and fro, the passengers mostly wouldn't be bothered to move to drink. So he accepted fast, no doubt considering me a mug as well as an actor. Sheridan Lorrimore, who was sitting at a table apart from his parents, demanded I bring him a double Scotch at once. He had a carrying voice, and his sister, from 2 tables away, turned round in disapproval. "No, you're not supposed to," she said. "Mind your own business." He turned his head slightly towards me and spoke in the direction of my tie. "Double Scotch at the double." "Don't get it," Xanthi said. I stood irresolute. Sheridan stood up, his ready anger rising. He put out a hand and pushed my shoulder fiercely. "Go on," he said. "Damn well do as I say. Go and get my drink." He pushed again, quite hard, and as I turned away I heard him snigger and say, "You have to kick him, you know." I went into the dome car and stood behind the bar with the bartender and felt furious with Sheridan, not for his outrageous behaviour, but because he was getting me noticed. Filmer had been sitting with his back to me, it was true, but near enough to overhear. Mercer Lorrimore appeared tentatively in the bar doorway, and came in when he saw me. "I apologize for my son," he said wearily, and I had a convincing impression that he'd apologized countless times before. He pulled out his wallet, removed a $20 note from it, and offered me the money. "Oh, please don't," I said. "There's no need." Yes, take it." I saw he would feel better if I did, as if paying money would somehow excuse the act. I thought he should stop trying to buy pardons for his son and pay for mental treatment instead. But then perhaps he had. There was more wrong with Sheridan than ill temper, and it had been obvious to his father for a long time. I didn't approve of what he was doing, but if I refused his money I would be more and more visible. So I took it, and when he had gone off in relief back towards the dining car, I gave it to the barman. "Well, what was all that about?" he asked curiously, pocketing the note without hesitation. When I explained, he said, "You should have kept the money. You should have charged him triple." "He would have felt 3 times as virtuous," I said, and the barman looked at me blankly. I didn't go back to the dining car, but forward into the lounge, where again the sight of my yellow waistcoat stirred a few thirsts, which I did my best to accommodate. The barman was by now mellow and helpful, and said we were rapidly running out of the ice that had come aboard in bags in Sudbury. Up in the dome, the uncoupling of the private car had given way to speculation about whether the Northern Lights would oblige. The weather was right, apparently. I took a few drinks up there, including some for Zack and Donna, which amused them, and on my way down the stairs saw the backs of Mercer and Bambi, Filmer and Daffodil, as they walked through the lounge towards the door to the private car. Mercer stood aside to let Bambi lead the other two through the short, noisy joining section, and then, before going himself, he looked back, saw me, and beckoned. "Bring a bowl of ice, will you?" he said when I reached him. "To the saloon?" "Yes, sir," I said. He nodded and departed, and I relayed the request to the barman, who shook his head and said he was down to 6 cubes. I knew there were other bags of cubes in the kitchen refrigerator, so, feeling that I had been walking the train for a lifetime, I went along through the dining room to fetch some. There weren't many people still in there, though Xanthi was still being comforted and listened to by Mrs. Young. Nell sat opposite Sheridan Lorrimore, who seemed to be telling her that he had wrapped his Lamborghini round a tree recently and had ordered a new one. "Tree?" Nell said, smiling. He looked at her uncomprehendingly. Sheridan wasn't a great one for jokes. I fetched a bag of ice and a bowl from the kitchen, swayed back to the bar, and in due course took the bowl of ice on a tray to the saloon. The 4 of them were sitting in armchairs, Bambi talking to Daffodil, Mercer to Filmer. Mercer said to me, "You'll find glasses and cognac in the cupboard in the dining room, and Benedictine. Bring them along here, will you?" "Yes, sir." Filmer paid me no attention. In the neat dining room, the cupboards had glass fronts with pale green curtains inside them. In one I found the bottles and glasses as described and took them aft. Filmer was saying, "Will voting right go on to the Breeders' Cup if he wins at Winnipeg?" "He's not running at Winnipeg," Mercer said. "He runs at Vancouver." "Oh, yes, I meant Vancouver." Daffodil, with enthusiasm, was telling a cool Bambi that she should try some face cream or other that helped with wrinkles. "Just believe everything," Mercer said to me. "We'll pour." "Yes, sir," I said, and retreated as he began the ultimate heresy of sloshing Remy Martin's finest onto rocks. Mercer would know me everywhere on the train, I thought, but none of the other 3 would. I hadn't met Filmer's eyes all day, had been careful not to, and it seemed to me that his attention had been exclusively focused upon what he had now achieved, a visiting terms acquaintanceship with Mercer Lorrimore. There was now loud music in the lounge, with 2 couples trying to dance and falling over with giggles from the perpetual motion of the dance floor. Up in the dome, Aurora Borealis was doing its flickering fiery best on the horizon, and in the bar there was a group playing poker in serious, silent concentration. "Playing for thousands," the barman said. Between the bar and the dining room there were 3 bedrooms, and in one of those, with the door open, was a sleeping car attendant, dressed exactly like myself. "Hello," he said as I paused in the doorway. "Come to help?" "Sure," I said. "What do I do?" "You're the actor, aren't you?" he asked. It's hush-hush." He nodded. "I won't say a word." He was of about my own age, perhaps a bit older, pleasant-looking and cheerful. He showed me how to fold up the ingenious mechanism of the daytime armchairs and slide them under a bed which pulled out from the wall. A top bunk was then pulled down from the ceiling, complete with ladder. He straightened the bedclothes and laid a wrapped chocolate truffle on each pillow, a good-night blessing. "Neat?" I said. He had only 1 more room to do, he said, and he should have finished long before this, but he'd been badly delayed in the car on the other side of the dining car, which he had in his care also. I nodded, and several thoughts arrived simultaneously in a rush on my mental doorstep. They were that Filmer's bedroom was in that car. Filmer was at that moment with the Lorrimores. The only locks on the bedroom doors were inside, in the form of bolts to ensure privacy. There was no way of preventing anyone from walking in if a room were empty. I went along to the sleeping car on the far side of the kitchen and opened the door of the abode of Julius Apollo. Chapter 9. By virtue of having paid double and possibly treble, Filmer had a double bedroom all to himself. Only the lower bunk had been prepared for the night. The upper was still in the ceiling. For all that he could be expected to stay in the Lorrimores' car for at least 15 more minutes, I felt decidedly jittery, and I left the door open so that if he did come back unexpectedly, I could say I was merely checking that everything was in order. My uniform had multiple advantages. The bedrooms were small, as one would expect, though in the daytime, with the beds folded away, there was comfortable space. There was a wash basin in full view, with the rest of the plumbing in a discreet little closet. For hanging clothes, there was a slot behind the bed heads of about 8 inches wide, enough in Filmer's case for 2 suits. Another 2 jackets hung on hangers on pegs on the wall. I searched quickly through all the pockets, but they were mostly empty. There was only in one inner pocket a receipt for a watch repair, which I replaced where I found it. There were no drawers. More or less everything else had to be in his suitcase, which stood against the wall. With an eye on the corridor outside, I tried one of the latches and wasn't surprised to find it locked. That left only a tiny cupboard above the hanging space, in which Julius Apollo had stored a black leather toilet bag and his brushes. On the floor below his suits, pushed to the back of the hanging space, I found his briefcase. I put my head out of the door, which was directly beside the hanging space, and looked up and down the corridor. No one in sight. I went down on hands and knees, half in and half out of the doorway, with an excuse ready of looking for a coin I'd dropped. I put a hand into the hanging space and drew the briefcase to the front, and it was of black crocodile skin with gold clasps, as I'd seen at Nottingham races. The fact of its presence was all I was going to learn, however, as it had revolving combination locks which were easy enough to undo, but only if one had 2 hours to spend on each lock, which I hadn't. Whether or not the briefcase still contained whatever Hawfitz had given Filmer at Nottingham was anyone's guess, and dearly though I would have liked to look at the contents, I didn't want to risk any more at that point. I pushed the black case deep into the hanging space again, stood up outside the door, closed it, and went back to the scenes of jollity to the rear. It was by this time nearly midnight. The Youngs were standing up in the dining room, ready to go to bed. Xanthi, however, alarmed by the departure of her newfound friend, was practically clinging to Mrs. Young, and with an echo of the earlier hysteria was saying that she couldn't possibly sleep in the private car. She would have nightmares. She would be too scared to stay. She was sure whoever had uncoupled the car before would do it again in the middle of the night, and they would all be killed when the Canadian crashed into them, because the Canadian was still there behind us, wasn't it? Wasn't it? Yes, it was. Mrs. Young did her best to soothe her, but it was impossible not to respect her fears. She had undoubtedly nearly been killed. Mrs. Young told her that the madman who had mischievously unhitched the car was hours behind us in Cartier, but Xanthi was beyond reassurance. Mrs. Young appealed to Nell, asking if there was anywhere else that Xanthi could sleep, and Nell, consulting the ever-present clipboard, shook her head doubtfully. "There's an upper berth in a section," she said slowly, "but it only has a curtain, and no facilities except at the end of the car, and it's hardly what Xanthi's used to." "I don't care," Xanthi said passionately. "I'll sleep on the floor or on the seats in the lounge or anywhere. I'll sleep in that upper berth. Please let me." "I don't see why not, then," Nell said. "What about night things?" "I'm not going into our car to fetch them. I'm not." "All right," Nell said. "I'll go and ask your mother." Mrs. Young stayed with Xanthi, who was again faintly trembling, until at length Nell returned with both a small grip and Bambi. Bambi tried to get her daughter to change her mind, but predictably without success. I thought it unlikely that Xanthi would ever sleep in that car again, so strong was her present reaction. She, Bambi, Nell, and the Youngs made their way past me without looking at me, and continued on along the corridor beside the kitchen, going to inspect the revised quarters, which I knew were in the sleeping car forward of Filmer's. After a while, Bambi and Nell returned alone, and Bambi, with an unexcited word of gratitude to Nell, walked a few paces forward and stopped beside her son, who had done nothing to comfort or help his sister, and was now sitting alone.
"Come along, Sheridan,"
she said, her tone without peremptoriness, but also without affection.
"Your father asks you to come."
Sheridan gave her a look of hatred, which seemed not in the least to bother her. She stood patiently waiting until, with exceedingly bad grace, he got to his feet and followed her homewards. Bambi, it seemed to me, had taught herself not to care for Sheridan so as not to be hurt by him. She, too, like Mercer, must have suffered for years from his boorish behaviour in public, and she had distanced herself from it. She didn't try to buy the toleration of the victims of his rudeness, as Mercer did. She ignored the rudeness instead. I wondered which had come first, the chill and disenchantment of her worldly sophistication, or the lack of warmth in her son. And perhaps there was ice in both of them, and the one had reinforced the other. Bambi, I thought, was a highly inappropriate name for her. She was no innocent, wide-eyed, smooth-skinned fawn, but an experienced, aloof, good-looking woman in the skin of minx. Nell, watching them go, sighed and said,
"She didn't kiss Xanthi good night, you know, or give her even a hug to comfort her. Nothing. And Mercer's so nice."
"Ah, forget them."
"Yes. You do realize the press will be down on this train like a pack of hunting lions at the next stop?"
"Lionesses," I said.
"What?"
"It's the females who hunt in a pack. One male sits by, watching, and takes the lion's share of the kill."
"I don't want to know that."
"Our next stop," I said, "will be 15 minutes at White River in the middle of the night. After the delay, we'll aim to arrive at 4:05, depart 4:20.
"And after that?"
"Oh, except for a 3-minute pause in a back of beyond, we stop at Thunder Bay for 25 minutes at 10:50 tomorrow morning."
"Do you know the whole timetable by heart?"
"Emile told me to learn it. He was right when he said the question I would have to answer most was, 'When do we reach so-and-so?' And if I were a regular waiter, he said I would know the answers, even though we're 35 minutes earlier everywhere than the regular Canadian."
"Emile is cute," she said.
I looked at her in surprise. I wouldn't have thought of Emile as cute. Small, neat, bright, and generous, yes.
"Cute?"
I asked. "I would hope," she said, "that you don't think so." "No." "Good." She was relieved, I saw. "Weren't you sure?" I asked curiously. "Am I so ambivalent?" "Well," there was a touch of embarrassment, "I didn't mean to get into this sort of conversation. Really, I didn't, but if you want to know, there's something about you that's secret, ultra-private, as if you didn't want to be known too well. So I just wondered. I'm sorry." "I shall shower you with ravening kisses." She laughed. "Not your style." "I'll wait and see." And two people didn't, I thought, drift into talking like that after knowing each other for such a short while, unless there was immediate trust and liking. We were standing in the tiny lobby between the kitchen and the dining room, and she still had the clipboard clasped to her chest. She would have to put it down, I thought fleetingly, before any serious ravening could take place. "You always have jokes in your eyes," she said. "And you never tell them." "I was thinking about how you use your clipboard as chain mail." Her own eyes widened. "A lousy man in the magazine office squeezed my breast." "Why am I telling you? It was years ago. Why should I care? Anyway, where else would you carry a clipboard?" She put it down, all the same, on the counter. But we didn't talk much longer as the revellers from the rear began coming through to go to the bedrooms. I retreated into the kitchen, and I could hear people asking Nell what time they could have breakfast. "Between 7 and 9:30, she said. "Sleep well, everybody." She put her head into the kitchen. "Same to you. Sleep well. I'm off to bed." "Good night," I said, smiling. "Aren't you going?" "Yes, in a while." "When everything's safe?" You might say so.
What exactly does the Jockey Club expect you to do?
See trouble before it comes.
But that's practically impossible.
I said. I didn't foresee anyone uncoupling the Lorrimores.
You'll be fired for that,
she said dryly.
So if you sleep, sleep well.
Tor would kiss you, I said. Tommy can't.
I'll count it done.
She went away blithely, the clipboard again in place. A habit, I supposed, as much as a defence. I walked back to the bar and wasted time with the barman. The intent poker school looked set for an all-night session. The dancing was still causing laughter in the lounge, and the northern lights were entrancing the devotees in the dome. The barman yawned and said he'd be closing the bar soon. Alcohol stopped at midnight. I heard Daffodil's voice before I saw her, so that when Filmer came past the door of the bar, I was bending down with my head below the counter as if to be tidying things there. I had the impression they did no more than glance in as they passed, as Filmer was saying, "When we get to Winnipeg."
"You mean Vancouver?"
Daffodil said. "Yes, Vancouver.
You always get them mixed."
Her voice, which had been raised, as his had been, so as to be heard while one of them walked ahead of the other, died away as they passed down the corridor, presumably en route to bed. Giving them time to say good night, as Daffodil's room was one of the three just past the bar, I slowly followed. They were nowhere in sight as I went through to the dining car, and Filmer seemed to have gone straight to his room, as there was a thread of light shining along the bottom of his door. But Daffodil, I discovered, had after all not. Instead of being cosily tucked up in her bunk near the bar, she surprisingly came walking towards me from the sleeping car forward of Filmer's, her diamonds lighting small bright fires with every step. I stood back to let her pass, but she shimmered to a stop before me and said,
"Do you know where Miss Lorrimore is sleeping?"
"In the car you've just come from, madam," I answered helpfully.
"Yes, but where? I told her parents that I would make sure she was all right."
"The sleeping car attendant will know," I said, "if you would like to follow me." She nodded assent, and as I turned to lead the way, I thought that at close quarters she was probably younger than I'd assumed, or else that she was older but immature, an odd impression, fleeting and gone. The middle-aged sleeping-car attendant was dozing but dressed. He obligingly showed Daffodil the upper berth where Xanthi was sleeping, but the thick felt curtains were closely fastened, and when Daffodil called the girl's name quietly, there was no response. The slightly fatherly attendant said he was sure she was safely asleep, as he'd seen her returning from the washroom at the end of the car and climbing up to her bunk.
"I guess that will do,"
Daffodil said, shrugging off someone else's problem.
"Good night, then, and thank you for your help."
We watched her sway away, holding onto the rails, her high curls shining, her figure neat, her intense musky scent lingering like a memory in the air after she herself had gone. The sleeping-car attendants sighed deeply at so much opulent femininity, and philosophically returned to his roomette, and I went on up the train into the next car, where my own bed lay. George Burley's door, 2 along from mine, was wide open, and I found he was in residence, dressed but asleep, quietly snoring in his armchair. He jerked awake as if with a sixth sense, as I paused in his doorway and said, "Oh, what's wrong, eh?" "Nothing that I know of," I said. Oh, it's you. I'm sorry I woke you." "I wasn't asleep. Well, napping, then. I'm used to that. I've been on the railways all my life, eh?"
"A love affair?" I said.
"You can bet your life." He rubbed his eyes, yawning. "In the old days, there were many big railway families. Father to son, cousins, uncles. It got handed down. My father, my grandfather, they were railway men. But my sons, eh? They're behind desks in big cities tapping out computers." He chuckled. "They run the railways too now from behind desks, eh? They sit in Montreal making decisions, and they've never heard a train's call at night across the prairie. They've missed all that. These days the top brass fly everywhere, eh?" His eyes twinkled. Anyone who wasn't a wheels-on railwoman was demonstrably stupid. "I'll tell you," he said. "I hope to die on the railways." "Well, not too soon, though."
"Oh, not before White River, at any rate."
I said good night and went to my own room, where I found the sleeping car attendant had duly lowered my bed and laid a chocolate truffle on the pillow. I ate the chocolate. Very good. I took off the yellow waistcoat with its white lining and hung it on a hanger, and I took off my shoes, but rather like George, I still felt myself to be on duty. So I switched off the light and lay on top of the bedclothes watching the black Canadian land slide by, while the free northern show went on above for hours in the sky. There seemed to be wide horizontal bands of light which slowly changed in intensity, with brighter spots growing and fading in places, mysteriously, against the deeps of eternity. It was peaceful more than frenetic, a mirage of slow dawns and sunsets, going back to the fluted point people. Humbling. In the context of 10,000 years, I thought, what did Filmer and his sins matter? Yet all we had was here and now, and here and now, always, through time, was where the struggle towards goodness had to be fought. Towards virtue, morality, uprightness, order, call it what one liked. A long, ever-recurring battle. In the here and now we stopped without incident at White River. I saw George outside under the station lights and watched him set off towards the rear of the train. Apparently the Lorrimores were still safely with us as he came back presently without haste or alarm, and after a while the train made its usual unobtrusive departure westwards. I slept for a couple of hours, and was awakened while it was still dark by a gentle rapping on my door. It proved to be Emile, fully dressed and apologetic.
"I didn't know if I should wake you. If you are serious about this, it is time to set the tables for breakfast."
"I'm serious," I said. He smiled with seeming satisfaction.
"It is much easier with 4 of us."
I said I would come at once, and made it, washed, shaved, and tidy, in roughly 10 minutes. Oliver and Cathy were already there, wide awake. The kitchen was filled with glorious smells of baking, and Angus, with languid largesse, said he wouldn't notice if we ate a slice or two of his raisin bread, or of his apple and walnut. Simone said dourly that we were not to eat the croissant, as there wouldn't be enough. It was all rather like school. We set the places, put fresh water and carnations in bud vases, 1 flower to each table, and folded pink napkins with precision. By 7:15 the first breakfasters were addressing themselves to Eggs Benedict, and I was pouring tea and coffee as to the service born. At 7:30, in struggling daylight, we stopped briefly in a place identified in suitably small letters on the small station as Schreiber. It was from here, I reflected, looking through the windows at a small, scattered town, that the dispatcher had spoken to George and me the previous evening. And while I watched, George appeared outside, and was met by a man who came from the station. They conferred for a while, then George returned to the train, and the train went quietly on its way. A spectacular way. All through breakfast, the track ran along the north shore of Lake Superior, so close that at times the train seemed to be overhanging the water. The passengers oohed and ahed, the Unwins, up a gum tree, sitting with the owners of Flocati, the Ready Hots, with a couple talking incessantly of the prowess of their horse, Wordmaster, also on the train. Filmer came alone to sit at an untenanted table, ordering eggs and coffee from Oliver without looking at him. Presently the Youngs appeared, and with smiling acquaintanceship joined Filmer. I wondered if he thought immediately of Ezra Gideon, the Youngs' dear friend, but his face showed nothing but politeness. Xanthi ambled in a tousled, yawning state, and yesterday's clothes, and flopped into the empty chair beside Filmer. Interestingly, he made no attempt to save the seat for Daffodil, but seemed to echo Mrs. Young's inquiries about how Xanthi had slept. Like a log, it appeared, although she seemed to regret not reporting constant nightmares. Mr. Young looked bored, as if he'd tired of the subject a long time ago, but his wife retained her sweet, comforting expression without any visible effort. I waited with hovering impatience for Nell to arrive, which she did at length in a straight black skirt, worse and worse, with a prim coffee blouse and unobtrusive gold earrings. She had drawn her fair hair high into an elaborate plait down the back of her head, and fastened it at the bottom with a wide tortoiseshell clasp. It looked distinguished and competent, but nowhere near cuddly. People I hadn't yet identified beckoned her eagerly to join them, which she did with the ravishing smile she had loosed once or twice in my direction. She told Cathy she would pass on the eggs, but would like croissant and coffee, and presently I was bringing them to her as she sat with eyes demurely downwards, studiously ignoring my existence. I set butter, jam, and breads before her. I poured into her cup. She told her table companions it was nice having hand-picked attendants all the way to Vancouver. I knew it was a game, but I could cheerfully have strangled her. I didn't want them noticing me even a little. I went away and looked back and met her eyes, which were laughing. It was the sort of look between us which would have started alert interest in me if I'd spotted it between others. And I thought I was near to losing my grip on what I was supposed to be doing, and that I'd better be more careful. I hadn't needed to serve her. I'd taken the tray from Cathy. Temptation will be your downfall, Tor, I thought. Except for Xanthi, Mercer was the only Lorrimore to surface for breakfast, and he came not to eat, but to ask Emile to send trays through to his own private dining room. Emile himself and Oliver delivered the necessary, although Emile on his return said he hoped this wasn't going to happen at lunch and dinner also, because it took too much time. Room service was strictly not available, yet one didn't disoblige the Lorrimores if one could help it. Daffodil arrived after everyone else, with each bright curl in place, and pleasantly sat across the aisle from the Filmer Young table, asking for news of Xanthi's night. The only people not bothering to ask, it seemed, were the near victim's own family. Xanthi chattered and could be heard telling Daffodil she felt snug and safe behind her curtain. The next time I went slowly past their table, refill coffee pot at the ready, the conversation was back to the journey, with Xanthi this time saying she basically thought horse racing boring, and she wouldn't have come on this trip if her father hadn't made her. "How did he make you?" Filmer said interestedly. She sounded suddenly flustered, and evaded an answer. He made Sheridan come too." "But why, if you both didn't want to?" That was Daffodil's voice behind my back. "He likes us where he can see us, he says." There was a note of grudge and bitterness, but also, it seemed to me, a realistic acknowledgment that father knew best. And judging from Sheridan's behaviour to date, under his father's long-suffering eye was certainly the son's safest place. The conversation faded into the distance, and I paused to refill the Unwin's cups, where the talk was about Upper Gumtree having the edge over Mercer's Premier that was coming to Winnipeg by road. George Burley presently came into the dining car and spoke for a while to Nell, who subsequently went from table to table, clipboard in place, repeating what he'd said. "We're stopping at Thunder Bay for longer than scheduled, as there'll be an investigation there about the Larimore's car being uncoupled. We'll be there about an hour and a half, as we're not going on until after the regular Canadian has gone through. The Canadian will be ahead of us then all the way to Winnipeg." "What about lunch?" Mr. Young asked. Mr. Young, though thinnish, had a habit of eating half his wife's food as well as his own. "We'll leave Thunder Bay at about 1:45, Nell said, "so we'll have lunch soon after, and a more leisurely dinner before we get to Winnipeg, instead of having to crowd it in early. It will all fit in quite well." She was smiling, reassuring, keeping the party from unravelling. "You'll be glad to stretch your legs for a bit longer in Thunder Bay, and some of you might visit your horses." The owner of Ready Hot, who seemed to spend most of his time reading a guidebook, told Mr. and Mrs. Wordmaster, who looked suitably impressed, that Thunder Bay, one of Canada's largest ports, was at the far west end of the St. Lawrence Great Lakes Seaway, and should really be called what the locals called it, the Lakehead. Grain from the prairies was shipped from there to throughout the world, he said. "Fancy that," said Mrs. Wordmaster, who was English. I retreated from this scintillating conversation and helped Oliver and Cathy clear up in the kitchen, and shortly before 11 we slid to a halt in the port that was halfway across Canada, on some rails parallel with, but a little removed from, the station buildings. Immediately a waiting double posse of determined-looking men advanced from the station across two intervening tracks, one lot sprouting press cameras, the other notebooks. George stepped down from the train to meet the notebook people, and the others fanned out and began clicking. One of the notebook crowd climbed aboard and came into the dining car, inviting anyone who had seen anyone or anything suspicious the previous evening to please unbutton. But of course no one had, or no one was saying, because otherwise the whole train would have known about it by now. The investigator said he would try his luck with the scenery watchers in the dome car, with apparently the same result. And from there he presumably went in to see the Lorrimores, who, apart from Xanthi, was still in seclusion. He then reappeared in the dining car with an interested crowd of people following him, and asked to speak to Xanthi, who up until then had kept palely quiet. He identified her easily, because everyone looked her way. Filmer was still beside her. The passengers tended all the time to linger at the tables, talking after the meals had been cleared, rather than return to the solitude of their bedrooms. Nearly everyone, I would have guessed, had been either in the dining-room or the dome car all morning. Mrs. Young squeezed Xanthi's hand encouragingly from across the table, while the half-child, half-young woman shivered her way through the dangerous memory.
"No,"
she said, with everyone quiet and attentively listening.
"No one suggested I went to our car. I just wanted to go to the bathroom, and I could have been killed."
Yes, the investigator, middle-aged and sharp-eyed, was sympathetic but calming, speaking in a distinct voice that carried easily through the dining car, now that we weren't moving. "Was there anyone in the dome car lounge when you went through?"
"Lots of people."
Xanthi's voice was much quieter than his. "Did you know them?"
"No. I mean, they were on this trip. Everyone there was."
She was beginning to speak more loudly so that all could hear. A few heads nodded. "No one you now know was a stranger?"
"No."
Mrs. Young, intelligent besides comforting, asked,
"Do you mean it's possible to uncouple a car while you're actually on the train? You don't have to be on the ground to do it?"
The investigator gave her his attention, and everyone leaned forward slightly to hear the answer. "It's possible. It can be done also while the train is moving, which is why we want to know if there is anyone in the dome car who was unknown to you all. Unknown to any of you, I should say." There was a long, respectful, understanding silence. Nell said, "I suppose I know most of our passengers by sight by now. I identified them all at Toronto Station when I was allocating their sleeping quarters. I didn't see anyone yesterday evening who puzzled me." "You don't think," Mrs. Young said, putting her finger unerringly on the implication, "that the car was unhitched by someone in our party?" "We're investigating all possibilities," the investigator said without pompousness. He looked around at the ranks of worried faces, and his slightly severe expression softened. "The private car was deliberately uncoupled," he said. "But we're of the preliminary opinion that it was an act of mischief committed by someone in Cartier, the last place you stopped before Miss Lorrimore found the car was missing. But we do have to ask if the saboteur could have been on the train just in case any of you noticed anything wrong." A man at the back of the crowd said, "I was sitting in the dome car lounge when Xanthi came through, and I can tell you that no one had come the other way. I mean, we all knew that only the Lorrimores' car was behind the dome car. If anyone except the Lorrimores had gone that way and come back again, well, we would have noticed." Another nodding of heads. People noticed everything to do with the Lorrimores. I was watching the scene from the kitchen end of the dining car, standing just behind Emile, Cathy, and Oliver. I could see Xanthi's troubled face clearly, and also Filmer's beside her. He seemed to me to be showing diminishing interest in the inquiry, turning his tidily brushed head away to look out of the window instead. There was no tension in him. When he was tense, there was a rigidity in his neck muscles, a rigidity I'd watched from the depths of the crowd during the brief day of his trial, and seen a few times since, as at Nottingham. When Filmer felt tense, it showed. Even as I watched him, His neck went rigid. I looked out of a window to see what he was looking at, but there seemed to be nothing of great note, only the race-going passengers streaming off their forward carriages en route to write postcards home from the station. Filmer looked back towards Xanthi and the investigator and made a small gesture of impatience, and it seemed to trigger a response from the investigator, because he said that if anyone remembered any helpful detail, however small, would they please tell him or one of his colleagues, but meanwhile everyone was free to go. There was a communal sigh as the real-life investigation broke up. Zack, I thought, would be finding the competition too stiff, the fiction an anticlimax after the fact. He hadn't appeared for this scene. None of the actors had. Most of the passengers went off to don coats against what appeared to be a cold wind outside. But Filmer climbed down from the door of the dome car end of the dining car without more protection than his carefully casual shirt and aristocratic tweed jacket. He paused irresolutely, not scrunching, as the others were beginning to, across the two sets of rails between our train and the station, but meandering at an angle forward in the direction of the engine. Inside I followed him, easily keeping pace with his slow step. I thought at first that he was merely taking an open-air path to his own bedroom, but he went straight past the open door at the end of his sleeping car, and straight on past the next car also. Going to see his horse, no doubt. I went on, following. It had become a habit. At the end of the third car, just past George Burley's office, he stopped, because someone was coming out from the station to meet him. A gaunt man, in a padded short coat with a fur collar, with grey hair blowing in disarray in the wind. They met between George's window and the open door at the end of the car, and although at first they looked moderately at peace with each other, the encounter deteriorated rapidly. I risked them seeing me so as to try to hear, but in fact by the time I could hear them they were shouting, which meant I could listen through the doorway without seeing them or being seen. Filmer was yelling furiously, "I said before Vancouver!" The gaunt man, with a snarl in his Canadian voice, said, "You said before Winnipeg, and I've done it, and I want my money." "Cooey!" trilled Daffodil, teetering towards them in chinchillas and high-heeled boots. "Are we going to see Laurentide Eyes?" Chapter 10. Blast her, I thought intensely. Triple bloody shit, and several other words to that effect. I watched through George's window as Filmer made great efforts to go towards her with a smile, drawing attention away from the gaunt-faced man who returned to the station. Before Winnipeg, before Vancouver. Julius Apollo had mixed them up yet again. "You said before Winnipeg, and I've done it, and I want my money." Heavy words, full of threat. What before Winnipeg? What had he done? What indeed? It couldn't have been the Lorrimores' car, I thought. Filmer had shown no interest and no tension, had been obviously uninvolved. But then he would have been calm, I supposed, if he hadn't been expecting anything to happen except before Vancouver. He hadn't been expecting the Lorrimores' car to be uncoupled before either city. Of that I was certain. He had instead been cultivating his acquaintanceship with Mercer, a game plan that would have come to an abrupt end if the Lorrimores had deserted the trip, which they would have done at once if the Canadian had ploughed into their home from home. If not the Lorrimores' car, what else had happened? What had happened before Winnipeg that Filmer had intended to happen before Vancouver? In what way had the gaunt man already earned his money? Anyone's guess, I thought. He could have robbed someone, bribed a stable lad, nobbled a horse. Nobbled a horse that was going to run at Winnipeg, instead of one running at Vancouver. From the fury in their voices, the mistake had been devastating. Only Flocati and Upper Gumtree were due to run at Winnipeg. Laurentide Ice was running at Vancouver against Voting Right and Sparrowgrass. Could Filmer have been so stupid as to get the horses' names wrong in addition to the cities? No, he couldn't. Impasse. Yet, Gauntface had done something. Sighing, I watched the Youngs walk past the window en route, I supposed, to the horse-car. Soon after, the Unwins followed. I would have liked to have checked at once on the state of the horses, but I supposed if there was something wrong with any of them, I would hear soon enough. I wished I'd been able to take a photograph of Gauntface, but I'd been more keen to listen. If he'd done something to or around the horses, I thought, then he had to have travelled with us on the train. He hadn't just met us in Thunder Bay. If he'd been on the train and had walked with the other racegoers towards the station, Filmer could have seen him through the window, and just the sight of him had caused the tensing of the neck muscles. And if Filmer hadn't yet paid him for whatever, then he would come back to the train. I left George's office and went 2 doors along to my roomette to dig my telescopic lens binoculars camera out of Tommy's holdall, and I sat and waited by the window for Gauntface's return. What happened instead was that after a while Filmer and Daffodil appeared in my view, making a diagonal course towards the station buildings, and pretty soon afterwards, accompanied by a lot of bell-ringing and warning hooters, a huge bright yellow diesel engine came grinding and groaning past my window, followed by long corrugated silver coaches, as the whole of the regular Canadian rolled up the track next to the race train and stopped precisely alongside. Instead of a nice clear photographic view of the station, I now faced the black uninformative window of someone else's roomette. Frustration and damnation, I thought. I tucked the binoculars into the holdall again, and without any sensible plans, wandered back towards the dining car. If I went on like this, I would fulfil the gloomiest fears of Bill Baudelaire, the Brigadier, and above all John Millington. "I told you we should have sent an ex-policeman." I could hear his voice in my ear. It occurred to me when I reached Julius Apollo's door that the Canadian would be standing where it was for the whole of the 25 minutes of its daily scheduled stop. For 25 minutes, say 22 by now, Filmer would stay over in the station. He would not walk round either end of the lengthy Canadian to return to his room. Would he? No, he would not. Why should he? He'd only just gone over there. I had 20 minutes to see what I could do about his combination locks. If I'd paused for more thought, I perhaps wouldn't have had the nerve, but I simply opened his door, checked up and down the corridor for observers, none, and went inside, shutting myself in. The black briefcase was still on the floor at the back of the hanging space under the suits. I pulled it out, sat on one of the armchairs, and with a feeling of unreality, started on the right-hand lock. If anyone should come in, I thought confusedly. If the sleeping car attendant, for instance, came in. Whatever excuse could I possibly find? None at all. The right-hand combination wheels were set at 137. I methodically went on from there, 138, 139, 140, trying the latch after each number change. My heart hammered and I felt breathless. I was used to long-distance safety in my work, and in the past to many physical dangers, but never to this sort of risk. 141, 142, 143. I tried the latch over and over and looked at my watch. Only 2 minutes had gone. It felt like a lifetime. 144, 145. There were 1,000 possible combinations. 146, 147. In 20 minutes I could perhaps try 150 numbers. I had done this process before, once, but not under pressure, when Aunt Viv had set a combination on a new suitcase and then forgotten it. 148, 149. My face sweating, my fingers slipping on the tiny wheels from haste. 150, 151. With a snap, the latch flew open. It was incredible. I could hardly believe it. I'd barely started. All I needed now was double the luck. The left-hand combination number stood at 738. I tried the latch. Nothing. With just a hope that both locks opened to the same sesame, I turned the wheels to 151 and tried it. Nothing. Not so easy. I tried reversing it to 515. Nothing. I tried comparable numbers, 121, 212, 131, 313, 141, 414, 6, 7, 8, 9, 3 zeros. Zilch. My nerve deserted me. I rolled the left-hand wheels back to 738 and with the latch closed again, set the right-hand lock to 137. I polished the latches a bit with my shirt sleeve, then I put the briefcase back exactly as I'd found it, and took my leaf-trembling self along to the dining car, already regretting before I got there that I hadn't stayed until the Canadian left, knowing that I'd wasted some of the best, and perhaps the only chance I would get of seeing what Filmer had brought with him on the train. Perhaps if I'd tried 115, or 551, or 511, or 555... Nell was sitting alone at a table in the dining car, working on her interminable lists, those usually clipped to the clipboard. And I sat down opposite her, feeling ashamed of myself. She glanced up. "Hello," she said. "Hi." She considered me. "You look hot. Been running?" I'd been indulging in good heart exercise while sitting still. I didn't think I would confess. Sort of," I said. "How's things?" She glanced sideways with disgust at the Canadian. "I was just about to go over to the station when that arrived." That, as if taking the hint, began quietly to roll, and within 20 seconds we again had a clear view of the station. Most of the train's passengers, including Filmer and Daffodil, immediately started across the tracks to reboard. Among them, aiming for the racegoers' carriages, was Gauntface. God in heaven, I thought. I forgot about him. I forgot about photographing him. My wits were scattered. "What's the matter?" Nell said, watching my face. "I've earned a D-, a double D-." "You probably expect too much of yourself," she said dispassionately. "No one's perfect." "There are degrees of imperfection." "How big is the catastrophe?" I thought it over more coolly. Gauntface was on the train, and I might have another opportunity. I could undo one of the latches of Filmer's briefcase, and given time I might do the other. Correction, given nerve, I might do the other. "Okay," I said. "Let's say C- could do better. Still not good. Millington would have done better." Zack and Emile arrived together at that point, Emile ready to set the tables for lunch, Zack in theatrical exasperation, demanding to know if the actors were to put on the next scene before the meal as originally planned, and if not, when. Nell looked at her watch and briefly thought. "Couldn't you postpone it until cocktail time this evening?" "We're supposed to do the following scene then," he objected. "Well, couldn't you run them both together?" He rather grumpily agreed, and went away saying they would have to rehearse. Nell smiled sweetly at his departing back, and asked if I'd ever noticed how important everything was to actors. Everything except the real world, of course. "Pussycat," I said. "Oh, but I have such tiny, indulgent claws." Oliver and Cathy arrived, and with Emile began spreading tablecloths and setting places. I got to my feet and helped them, and Nell, with teasing amusement, watched me fold pink napkins into water lilies, and said, "Well, well, hidden depths," and I answered, "You should see my dishwashing," which were the sort of infantile surface remarks of something we both guessed might suddenly become serious. The surface, meanwhile, was safe and shimmering and funny, and would stay that way until we were ready for change. As usual, the passengers came early into the dining car, and I faded into the scenery in my uniform and avoided Nell's eyes. The passengers hadn't over-enjoyed their sojourn in the station, it appeared, as they'd been fallen upon by the flock of pressmen, who had taken Xanthi back again to the brink of hysteria, and had asked Mercer whether it wasn't unwise to flaunt the privilege of wealth in his private car, and hadn't he invited trouble by adding it to the train? Indignation on his behalf was thick in the air. Everyone knew he was public-spiritedly on the trip for the sake of Canadian racing. The Lorrimores, all four of them, arrived together to murmurs of sympathy, but the two young ones split off immediately from their parents and from each other, all of them gravitating to their various havens. The parents went to join Filmer and Daffodil of their own free will. Xanthi made a straight, piteous line to Mrs. Young, and Sheridan grabbed hold of Nell, who was by this time standing, saying that he needed her to sit with him. She was the only decent human being on the whole damned train. Nell, unsure of the worth of his compliment, nevertheless sat down opposite him, even if temporarily. Keeping Sheridan on a straight or even a wavy line definitely came into the category of crisis control. Sheridan had the looks which went with Julius's name, Apollo. He was tall, handsome, nearly blonde, a child of the sun. The ice, the arrogance, the lack of common sense and of control, these were the dark side tragedy. A mini-psychopath, I thought, and maybe not so mini at that, if Xanthi thought he should be in jail. The Australian Unwins, sitting with the rival owners of Flocati, were concerned about a lifelessness they had detected in Upper Gumtree, due to the fact that on the train their horse had been fed a restricted diet of compressed food nuts and high-grade hay, and the Flocati people were cheerfully saying that on so long a stretch without exercise, good hay was best. Hay was calming. "We don't want them climbing the walls," Mr. Flocati said. Upper Gumtree had looked asleep, Mrs. Unwin remarked with disapproval. The Flocati people beamed wide, trying to look sympathetic. If Upper Gumtree proved listless, so much the better for Flocati's chances. It seemed that all of the owners had taken the opportunity of visiting the horses while the train was standing still, and listen though I might, I could hear no one else reporting trouble. Upper Gumtree, it seemed to me, might revive spectacularly on the morrow, given oats, fresh air, and exercise. His race was still more than 48 hours away. If Gauntface had in fact given Upper Gumtree something tranquilizing, the effects would wear off long before then. On reflection, I thought it less and less probable that he had done any such things. He would have to have bypassed the dragon lady, Leslie Brown, for a start. Yet presumably at times she left her post to eat and sleep. "I said," Daffodil said to me distinctly, "would you bring me a clean knife? I've dropped mine on the floor." "Certainly, madam," I said, coming back abruptly to the matter in hand, and realizing with a shock that she had already asked me once. I fetched her a knife fast. She nodded merely, her attention again on Filmer, and he, I was mightily relieved to see, had taken no notice of the small matter. But how could I thought ruefully, how could I have possibly stopped concentrating when I was so close to him? Only one day ago the proximity had had my pulse racing. The train had made its imperceptible departure, and was rolling along again past the uninhabited infinity of rocks and lakes and conifers that seemed to march on to the end of the world. We finished serving lunch and coffee, and cleared up, and as soon as I decently could I left the kitchen and set off forward up the train. George, whom I looked for first, was in his office eating a fat, ragged beef sandwich and drinking Diet Coke. "How did it go?" I asked, "in Thunder Bay?" He scowled, but half-heartedly. "They found out nothing I hadn't told them. There was nothing to see. They're thinking now that whoever uncoupled the private car was on it when the train left Cartier." "On the private car?" I said in surprise. "That's right. The steam tube could have been disconnected in the station, eh? Then the train leaves Cartier with the saboteur in the Larrimores' car. Then, less than a mile out of Cartier, a saboteur pulls up the rod that undoes the coupling. Then the private car rolls to a stop and he gets off and walks back to Cartier." "But why should anyone do that?" "Grow up, sonny. There are people in this world who cause trouble because it makes them feel important. They're ineffective, in their lives. So they burn things and smash things, paint slogans on walls, leave their mark on something, Wreck trains, put slabs of concrete on the rails. I've seen it done. Power over others, that's what it's about. A grudge against the Larrimores, most like. Power over them, over their possessions. Well, that's what those investigators think." I said. "If that's the case, the saboteur wouldn't have walked back to Cartier, but up to some vantage point from where he could watch the smash." George looked startled. "Well, I suppose he might. Arsonists often help to put out the fires they've started." "You mean he would have waited around to help with the wreck? Even to help with casualties?" "Sure," I said. "Pure heady power to know you'd caused such a scene." "I didn't see anyone around," he said thoughtfully. When we went back to the car, I shone the lamp. There wasn't anyone moving, eh? Or anything like that.
So, what are the investigators going to do? I asked. His eyes crinkled and the familiar chuckle escaped.
Write long reports, eh? Tell us never to take private cars. Blame me for not preventing it, I dare say.
He didn't seem worried at the idea. His shoulders and his mind were broad. I left him with appreciation, and went forward into the central dining car, where all the actors were sitting in front of coffee cups and poring over typed sheets of stage directions, muttering under their breaths, and sometimes exclaiming aloud. Zack raised his eyes vaguely in my direction, but it would have been tactless to disrupt the thoughts behind them. So I pressed on forward, traversing the day-nighter and sleeping cars, and arriving at the forward dome car. There were a lot of people about everywhere, but no one looked my way twice. I knocked eventually on the door of the horse car, and after inspection and formalities that would have done an Iron Curtain country proud, was admitted again by Miss Brown to the Holy of Holies. Re-scrawling Tommy Titmouse on her list, I was interested to see how long it had grown, and I noticed that even Mercer hadn't been let in without signing. I asked the Dragon Lady if anyone had come in who wasn't an owner or a groom, and she bridled like a thin turkey, and told me that she had conscientiously checked every visitor against her list of bona fide owners, and only they had been admitted. "But you wouldn't know them all by sight," I said. "What do you mean?" she demanded. "Supposing, for instance, someone came and said they were Mr. Unwin, you would check that his name was on the list and let him in?" "Oh, yes, of course." "And suppose he wasn't Mr. Unwin, although he said he was?" "Oh, you're just being difficult," she said crossly. "I cannot refuse entry to the owners. They were given the right to visit, but they don't have to produce passports, nor do their wives or husbands." I looked down her visitors' list. Filmer appeared on it twice, Daffodil once. Filmer's signature was large and flamboyant, demanding attention. No one had written Filmer in any other way. It seemed that Gauntface hadn't gained entry by giving Filmer's name, at least. It didn't mean he hadn't given someone else's. I gave Leslie Brown her list back, and wandered around under her eagle eye, looking at the horses. They swayed peacefully to the motion, standing diagonally across the stalls, watching me incuriously, seemingly content. I couldn't perceive that Upper Gumtree looked any more sleepy than any of the others. His eyes were as bright, and he pricked his ears when I came near him. All of the grooms, except one who was asleep on some hay bales, had chosen not to sit in the car with their charges, and I imagined it was because of Leslie Brown's daunting presence. Racing lads, on the whole, felt a companionable devotion to their horses, and I would have expected more of them to be sitting on the hay bales during the day. "What happens at night on the train?" I asked Leslie Brown. "Who guards the horses then?" "I do," she said tartly. "They've given me a roomette or some such, but I take this thing seriously. I slept in here last night, and will do so again after Winnipeg and after Lake Louise. I don't see why you're so worried about anyone slipping past me." She frowned at me, not liking my suspicions. "When I go to the bathroom, I leave one groom in here and lock the horse's car door behind me. I'm never away more than a few minutes. I insist on one of the grooms being in here at all times. I am very well aware of the need for security, and I assure you that the horses are well guarded." I regarded her thin, obstinate face, and knew she believed to her determined soul in what she said. "As for the barns at Winnipeg and the stabling at Calgary," she added righteously, "they are someone else's responsibility. I can't answer for what happens to the horses there." She was implying, plain enough, that no one else could be trusted to be as thorough as herself. "Do you ever have any fun, Miss Brown?" I asked. "What do you mean?" she said, raising surprised eyebrows. "All this is fun." She waved a hand in general round the horse car. "I'm having the time of my life." And she wasn't being ironic, she truly meant it. "Well," I said a little feebly, "then that's fine." She gave two sharp little nods, as if that finished the matter, which no doubt it did, except that I still looked for gaps in her defences. I wandered one more time round the whole place,
seeing the sunlight slant in through the barred, unopenable windows, which would keep people out as well as horses in, smelling the sweet hay and the faint, musty odour of the horses themselves, feeling the swirls of fresh air coming from the rows of small ventilators along the roof, hearing the creaking and rushing noises in the car's fabric, and the grind of the electricity-generating wheels under the floor. In that long, warm, friendly space there were animals worth at present a total of many millions of Canadian dollars, worth more if any of them won at Winnipeg or Vancouver. I stood for a long while looking at voting right. If Bill Baudelaire's mother knew her onions, in this undistinguished-looking bay lay the dormant seed of greatness. Maybe she was right. Vancouver would tell. I turned away, casting a last assessing glance at Laurentide Ice, who looked coolly back, thanked the enthusiastic dragon for her cooperation, prim acknowledgment, and began a slow walk back through the train, looking for Gauntface. I didn't see him. He could have been behind any of the closed doors. He wasn't in the forward dome car, upstairs or down, nor in the open day-nighter. I sought out and consulted separately with 3 of the sleeping car attendants in the racegoers' sleeping cars, who frowned in turn, and said that first, the sort of jacket I was describing was worn by thousands, and second, everyone tended to look gaunt outside in the cold air. All the same, I said, if they came across anyone fitting that description in their care, please would they tell George Burley his name and room number. Sure, they each said. But wasn't this an odd thing for an actor to be asking? Zack, I improvised instantly at the first inquiry, had thought the gaunt man had an interesting face, and he wanted to ask if he could use him in a scene. Ah, yes, that made sense. If they found him, they would tell George. When I got back to George, I told him what I'd asked. He wrinkled his brow. I saw a man like that at Thunder Bay, he said. But I probably saw several men like that in all this trainload. What do you want him for? I explained that I'd told the sleeping car attendants that Zack wanted to use him in a scene. But you, George said, what do you want him for yourself? I looked at him, and he looked back. I was wondering how far I should trust him, and had an uncomfortable impression that he knew what I was thinking. Well, I said finally, he was talking to someone I'm interested in. I got a long, bright beam from the shiny eyes. Interested in the line of duty? Yes. He didn't ask who it was, and I didn't tell him. I asked him instead if he himself had talked to any of the owner's party. Well, of course I have, he said. I always greet passengers, when they board. I tell them I'm the conductor, tell them where my office is, and tell them if they've any problems to bring them to me. And do they? Have they? He chuckled. Most of the complaints go to your Miss Richmond, and she brings them to me. Miss Richmond? I repeated. Well, she's your boss, isn't she? Tall, pretty girl with her hair in a plait today, eh? Nell, I said. That's right, isn't she your boss? Colleague. Right then. The sort of problems the owner's party have had on this trip so far are a tap that won't stop dripping, a blind that won't stay down in one of the bedrooms, and a lady who thought one of her suitcases had been stolen, only it turned up in someone else's room. He beamed. Most of the owners have been along to see the horses. When they see me, they stop to talk. What do they say? I asked. What sort of things? Oh, only what you'd expect, the weather, the journey, the scenery. They ask what time we get to Sudbury, or Thunder Bay, or Winnipeg, or whatever. Has anyone asked anything that was different, or surprised you? Nothing surprises me, Sonny. He glowed with irony and bonhomie. What would you expect them to ask? I shrugged in frustration. What happened before Thunder Bay that shouldn't have? Well, Larimore's car, No, apart from that. You think something happened? Something happened, and I don't know what, and it's what I'm here to prevent. He thought about it, then said, When it turns up, you'll know, Maybe. Like if someone put something in the food, Sooner or later, everyone will be ill.
George!
I was dumbstruck. He chuckled.
We had a waiter once, years ago, who did that. He had a grudge against the world. He put handfuls of ground-up laxative pills into the chocolate topping over ice cream and watched the passengers eat it, and they all had diarrhea. Dreadful stomach pains. One woman had to go to hospital. She'd had 2 helpings. Oh, what did it do, eh?
Now, you frighten me stiff, I said frankly. Where do they keep the fodder for the horses? He stared, his perpetual smile fading.
Is that what you're afraid of? Something happening to the horses?
It's a possibility.
All the fodder is in the horse car, he said, except for some extra sacks of those cubes most of the horses are having, which are in the baggage car. Some of the horses would have their own special food brought along with them, sent by their trainers. One of the grooms had a whole set of separate bags, labeled Sunday evening, Monday morning, and so on. He was showing them to me.
Which horse was that for?
The one that belongs to that Mrs. Daffodil Quentin, I think. The groom said one of her horses died of colic or some such recently from eating the wrong things, and the trainer didn't want any more accidents, so he'd made up the feeds himself.
You're brilliant, George.
His ready laugh came back. Yeah, well, don't forget the water tank, eh? You can lift the lid. Where the plank floats, remember? You could dope all those horses at once with one quick cupful of mischief, couldn't you?
Chapter 11. Leslie Brown told us adamantly that no one could possibly have tampered with either the fodder or the water. When did the grooms last fill the buckets? I asked.
During the morning, she said. Each groom filled the bucket for his own horse when he wanted to. All of them had been in there seeing to their charges.
The horse's drinking water tank had been topped up, she said, by a hose pipe from the city's water supply during the first 20 minutes of our stop in Thunder Bay, in a procedure that she herself had supervised. George nodded and said the whole train had been rewatered at that point. Before Thunder Bay, I said. Could anyone have put anything in the water?
Certainly not. I've told you over and over again. I am here all the time.
And how would you rate all the grooms for trustworthiness? I said. She opened her mouth and closed it again and gave me a hard look.
I am here to supervise them, she said. I didn't know any of them before yesterday. I don't know if any of them could be bribed to poison the water. Is that what you want?
It's realistic, I said with a smile. She was unsoftened, unsoftenable.
My chair, as you see, she said carefully, is next to the water tank. I sit there and watch. I do not think, I repeat, I do not believe that anyone has tampered with the water.
I said calmingly. But you could ask the grooms, couldn't you, if they've seen anything wrong? She began to shake her head automatically, but then stopped and shrugged.
I'll ask them, but they won't have.
And, just in case, I said, in case the worst happens and the horses prove to have been interfered with, I think I'll take a sample of what's in the tank, and also what's in their buckets at this moment. You wouldn't object to that, Miss Brown, would you? She grudgingly said she wouldn't. George elected himself to go and see what could be done in the way of sample jars, and presently returned with gifts from the Chinese cook in the dome car, in the shape of 4 rinsed-out plastic tomato sauce bottles rescued from the rubbish bin. George and Leslie Brown took a sample from the tank, draining it, at the Dragon's good suggestion, from the tap lower down, where the buckets were filled. I visited Voting Right, Laurentide Ice, and Upper Gumtree, who all graciously allowed me to dip into their drink. With Leslie Brown's pen, we wrote the provenance of each sample on the source label and put all 4 containers into a plastic carrier bag, which Leslie Brown happened to have handy. Carrying the booty, I thanked her for her kindness in answering our questions and helping, and George and I retreated.
Oh, what do you think?
he said, as we started back through the train. I think she now isn't as sure as she says she is. He chuckled. She'll be doubly careful from now on. As long as it's not already too late. He looked as if it were a huge joke. Well, we could get the tank emptied, scrubbed and refilled at Winnipeg, he said. Too late. If there's anything in it, it was there before Thunder Bay, and the horses will have drunk some of it. Some horses drink a lot of water, but they're a bit fussy. They won't touch it if they don't like the smell. If there are traces of soap in it, for instance, or oil. They'd only drink doped water if it smelled all right to them. You know a lot about it, George commented. I've spent most of my life near horses, one way or another. We reached his office, where he said he had some paperwork to complete before we stopped, fairly soon, for 10 minutes at Kenora. We would be there at 5:20, he said. We were running 30 minutes behind the Canadian. There were places the race train didn't really need to stop, he said, except to keep pace with the Canadian. We needed always to stop where the trains were serviced for water, trash, and fuel. I had nowhere on our journey to and from the horse car seen the man with the gaunt face. George had pointed someone out to me in the day-nighter, but he was not the right person. Grey-haired, but too ill-looking, too old. The man I was looking for, I thought, was 50-something, maybe less. Still powerful, not in decline. In a vague way, I thought, he had reminded me of Derry Wolfram. Less bulky than the dead frightener, and not as smooth, but the same stamp of man, the sort Filmer seemed to seek out naturally. I sat for an hour in my roomette looking out at the unvarying scenery, and trying to imagine anything else that Filmer might have paid to have done. It was all the wrong way round, I thought. It was more usual to know the crime and seek the criminal, than to know the criminal and seek his crime. The 4 sample bottles of water stood in their plastic carrier on my roomette floor. To have introduced something noxious into that tank, Gauntface would certainly have to have bribed a groom. He wasn't one of the grooms himself, though perhaps he had been one, somewhere, sometime. The grooms on the train were all younger, thinner, and from what I'd seen of them in their uniform T-shirts, less positive. I couldn't imagine any of them having the nerve to stand up to Filmer and demand their money. I spent the brief stop at the small town of Kenora, hanging out of the open doorway past George's office, watching him on the station side of the train walk a good way up and down outside while he checked that all looked well. The Lorrimores' car, it appeared, was still firmly tacked on. Up behind the engine, 2 baggage handlers were loading a small pile of boxes. I hung out of the door on the other side of the train for a while, but no one was moving out there at all. George climbed back on board and closed the doors, and presently we set off again to our last stop before Winnipeg. I wished intensely that I had the power to see into Filmer's mind. I ached to foresee what he was planning. I felt blind and longed for second sight. Failing such superhuman qualities, however, there was only, as usual, ordinary observation and patience, and they both seemed inadequate and tame. I went along to the dining car, where I found that Zack had already positioned some of the actors at the tables for the cocktail hour double-length scene. He and Nell were agreeing that after the scene the actors would leave again, all except Giles the murderer, even though they didn't like being banished all the time and were complaining about it. Emile, laying tablecloths, said that wine alone was included in the fare, all other cocktails having to be paid for, and perhaps I'd better just serve the wine. He and Oliver and Cathy would do the rest. Fine by me, I said, distributing ashtrays and bud vases. I could set the wine glasses also, Emile said. Glasses for red wine and for white at each place. The passengers drifted in from their rooms in the dome car and fell into by now predictable patterns of seating. Even though to my mind Bambi Lorrimore and Daffodil Quentin were as compatible as salt and strawberries, the 2 women were again positioned opposite each other, bound there by the attraction between their men. When I put the wine glasses on their table, Mercer and Filmer were discussing worldwide breeding in terms of exchange rates. Daffodil told Bambi there was a darling little jewellery store in Winnipeg. Xanthi was still clinging to Mrs. Young. Mr. Young looked exceedingly bored. Sheridan had struck up an acquaintanceship with the actor-murderer Giles, a slightly bizarre eventuality which might have odd consequences. The Upper Gumtree Unwins and the Flocati couple seemed locked in common interest. Whether the instant friendship would wither after their mutual race would be Wednesday evening's news. Most of the other passengers I knew only vaguely, by face more than by name. I'd learned their names only to the extent that they owned horses in the horse car, or had touched bases with Filmer, which came to only about half. They were all, in general, pleasant enough, although one of the men sent nearly everything back to the kitchen to be reheated, and one of the women pushed the exceptional food backwards and forwards across her plate with flicking movements of her fork, sternly remarking that plain fare was all anyone needed for godliness. What she was doing among the racing fraternity I never found out. Zach's long scene began with impressive fireworks as soon as everyone in the dining car had been served with a drink. A tall man dressed in the full scarlet traditional uniform of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police strode into the dining car and in a conversation-stopping voice said he had some serious information for us. He had come aboard at Canora, he said, because the body of a groom from this train, called Ricky, had been found lying beside the railway lines near Thunder Bay. He had been wearing his race-train T-shirt, and he had identification in his pocket. The passengers looked horrified. The Mounty's impressive presence dominated the whole place, and he sounded undoubtedly authentic. He understood, he said, that the groom had been attacked earlier in Toronto, when he foiled the kidnapping of a horse, but he had insisted on making the journey nevertheless, having been bandaged by a Miss Richmond. Was that correct? Nell demurely said that it was. Among the actual owners of the horses, disbelief had set in the quickest. Mercer Lorrimore enjoyed the joke. Mounties, when investigating, didn't nowadays go around dressed for parades. "But we are in Manitoba," Mercer could be heard saying in a lull. "They've got that right. We passed the boundary with Ontario a moment ago. The Mounted Police's territory starts right there." "You seem to know all about it," our Mountie said. "What do you know about this dead groom?" "Nothing," Mercer said cheerfully. I glanced briefly at Filmer. His face was hard, his neck rigid, his eyes narrow, and I thought in a flash of Paul Shacklebury, the lad dead in his ditch. Stable lads in England, grooms in Canada, same job. What had Paul Shacklebury known about Filmer? Same old unanswerable question. "And why was he killed?" the Mountie asked. "What did he know?" I risked a glance, looked away. Filmer's mouth was a tight line. The answer to the question had to be in his tautly held head at that moment, and it was as inaccessible to me as Alpha Centauri. Zach suggested that Ricky had identified one of the hijackers. Perhaps, he said, the hijackers had come on the train. Perhaps they were among the racegoers, waiting another chance to kidnap their quarry. Filmer's neck muscles slowly relaxed, and I realized that for a moment he must have suspected that the scene had been specifically aimed at him. Perhaps he spent a lot of his time reacting in that way to the most innocent of remarks. Mavis and Walter Bricknell demanded that the Mountie should keep their own precious horse safe. The Mountie brushed them aside. He was taking over the inquiry into the death of Angelica Standish, he said. 2 deaths connected to the same train could be no coincidence. What was the connection between Angelica and Ricky? Zach said that he was in charge of the Angelica investigation. "No longer," said the Mountie. "We were now in the province of Manitoba, not Ontario, his territory exclusively." Zach's intended scene of investigation into Angelica's murder had been upstaged by the reality of the Lorrimores' car and then aborted by the long stop at Thunder Bay. Passing the questioning to the Mountie bridged the void neatly, and the Mountie told us that the reason that Steve, Angelica's business manager, also her lover, had not turned up at Toronto station was because he too was dead, struck down in his apartment by blows to the head with a mallet. The audience received the news of still more carnage with round eyes. The said Steve, the Mountie went on, seemed to have been in bed asleep at the time of his murder, and the Ontario police were wanting to interview Angelica Standish as a suspect.
"But she's dead,"
Mavis Bricknell said. After a pause, Donna said she and Angelica had talked for maybe 2 hours between Toronto and Sudbury, and Donna was sure Angelica couldn't have murdered Steve. She was lost without him. "Maybe," the Mountie said. "But if she was as upset as all that, why had she come on the train at all? Couldn't it have been to escape from having to realize that she'd killed her lover?" Giles the murderer calmly inquired whether any murder weapon had been found after Angelica had been killed. Also, Pierre asked, wouldn't Angelica's murderer have been covered with blood? The whole toilet compartment had been splashed. Zack and the Mountie exchanged glances. The Mountie said grudgingly that a blood-covered, rolled-up sheet of plastic had been found on the track near the area where Angelica must have been battered, and it could have been used as a poncho, and it was being investigated for blood type and fingerprints. Donna said, couldn't Steve and Angelica both have been killed by a mallet? That would make her innocent, wouldn't it? She couldn't believe that anyone as nice as Angelica could have been mixed up in an insurance swindle. What? What insurance swindle? I glanced involuntarily at Daffodil, but if there had been a flicker of her eyelids, I had missed it. Donna, in confusion, said she didn't know what insurance swindle. Angelica just mentioned that Steve was mixed up in an insurance swindle, and she was afraid that was why he had missed the train. Donna hadn't liked to probe any further. Sheridan Lorrimore, saying loudly that Angelica had been a bitch, made a lunging grab at the pistol sitting prominently in a holster on the Mountie's hip. The Mountie, feeling the tug, turned fast and put his hand down on Sheridan's wrist. It was a movement in a way as dexterous as John Millington on a good day, speaking of razor-sharp reactions, more like an athlete than an actor. "That gun's mine, sir," he said, lifting Sheridan's wrist 6 inches sideways and releasing it. "And, everybody, it's not loaded." There was a general laugh. Sheridan, universally unpopular, and having made a boorish fool of himself yet again, looked predictably furious. His mother, I noticed, had turned her head away. Mercer was shaking his. The Mountie, unperturbed, said he would be proceeding vigorously with the inquiries into both Angelica's and Ricky's deaths, and perhaps he would have news for everyone in Winnipeg. He and Zack went away together, and Donna drifted around from table to table for a while, telling everyone that poor Angelica had really been very sweet, not a murderess. And she, Donna, was dreadfully upset at the suggestion. She wrung out a real tear or two. She was undoubtedly an effective actress. "Well, what do you care?" Sheridan asked her rudely. "You only met her yesterday morning, and she was dead before dinner." Donna looked at him uncertainly. It sounded as if he really believed in Angelica's death. "Oh," she said, "some people you know at once." She moved on gently and presently disappeared, with disconsolate-looking shoulders, down the corridor beside the kitchen. Sheridan muttered under his breath several times, making the people he was sitting with uncomfortable. Emile and his crew, including me, immediately began setting the tables round the passengers for dinner, and were soon serving warm goat's cheese and radicchio salads, followed by circles of rare Chateaubriand with snow peas and matchstick carrots, and finally rich orange sorbets smothered in fluffy whipped cream and nuts. Most of the passengers persevered to the end, and looked as though it were no torture. My suggestion to Angus, while we were dishwashing after the battle, that maybe his food could have been injected somehow with a substance that even now could be working away to the detriment of everyone's health, was received by him with frosty amusement. Absolutely impossible, he assured me. I had surely noticed that nearly all the ingredients had come onto the train fresh. He was cooking this food, not bringing it in pre-frozen packs. I assured him truthfully that I had been impressed by his skill and speed, and I thought his results marvellous. "You actors," he said more indulgently, "will think of any impossible thing for a plot." Everyone got off the train at Winnipeg, 1,413 miles along the rails from Toronto. 2 large motor horse boxes were waiting for the horses, which were unloaded down and loaded up ramps. The grooms and Leslie Brown led the horses across from train to van and saw them installed, and then, carrying holdalls, themselves trooped onto a bus which followed the horse boxes away towards the racetrack. A row of buses waited outside the station to take the racegoers away to a variety of outlying motels, and a long new coach with darkly tinted windows was set aside for the owners. A few of the owners, like the Lorrimores and Daffodil and Filmer, had arranged their own transport separately, in the shape of chauffeur-driven limousines, their chauffeurs coming over to the train to carry their bags. The crew, after everyone else had left, tidied away into secure lockers every movable piece of equipment and goods, and then joined the actors in the last waiting bus. The Mountie, I was interested to see, was among us, tall and imposing, even with his scarlet and brass buttons tucked away in his bag. George came last, carrying an attaché case of papers, and looking over his shoulder at the train as if wondering if he'd forgotten anything. He sat in the seat across the aisle from me, and said the cars would be backed into a siding for 2 days, the engine would be removed and used elsewhere, and there would be a security guard on duty. In the siding the carriages would be unheated and unlit, and would come to life again only about an hour before we left on the day after tomorrow. We'd been able to keep the same crew from coast to coast, he said, only because of the 2 rest breaks along the way. The owners and some of the actors were staying in the Westin Hotel, which had, Nell had told everyone during dinner, a ballroom and comfort, and an indoor pool on the roof. There was a breakfast room set aside for the train party, where a piece of the mystery would unravel each morning. Apart from that, everyone was on their own. There were good shops, good restaurants, and good racing. Transport had been arranged to and from the racecourse. We would all come back to reboard the train after the Jockey Club race train stakes on Wednesday, and cocktails and dinner would be served as soon as we'd rolled out of the station. The party, in good humour, applauded. I'd decided not to stay in the same hotel as any of the groups of owners, actors, racegoers, or crew, and asked Nell if she knew of anywhere else. A tall order, it seemed. We put people almost everywhere, she said doubtfully. But only a few actors will be at the Holiday Inn. Why don't you try there? Although, actually, there is one place we haven't booked anyone into, and that's the Sheraton. But it's like the Westin, expensive. Never mind. I'll find somewhere, I said. And when the crew bus, after a short drive, stopped and disgorged its passengers, I took my grip and vanished on foot, and after asking directions, made a homing line to where no one else was staying. In my buttoned-up grey VIA raincoat, I was unexceptional to the receptionists of the Sheraton. The only problem, they said, was that they were full. It was late in the evening, the whole city was full. An annex, I suggested. 2 of them shook their heads and consulted with each other in low voices. Although they had no single rooms left, they said finally, they had had a late cancellation of a suite. They looked doubtful. I wouldn't be interested in that, they supposed. Yes, I would, I said, and gave them my American Express card with alacrity. So Tommy the waiter carefully hung up his yellow waistcoat with its white lining, and ordered some wine from room service, and in a while, after a long, easing shower, slept for 8 solid hours, and didn't dream about Filmer. In the morning I telephoned Mrs. Baudelaire, and listened again to the almost girlish voice on the wire. "Messages for the Invisible Man," she said cheerfully. Are you still invisible?" "Mostly, yes, I think." "Bill says Val Catto would like to know if you're still invisible to the quarry. Does that make sense to you?" "It makes sense, and the answer is yes." "They're both anxious." "And not alone," I said. "Will you tell them the quarry has an ally on the train, travelling, I think, with the racegoers. I've seen him once and will try to photograph him." "Goodness!" "Also, will you ask them whether certain numbers, which I'll tell you, have any significance in the quarry's life?" "Intriguing," she said. "Fire away." "Well, 3 numbers I don't know. 3 question marks, say. Then 151. 3 question marks, then 151, right?" "Right. I know it's not his car's number plate, or not the car he usually travels in. But ask if it fits his birthday in any way, or his phone number, or anything at all they can think of. I want to know what the first 3 digits are. I'll ask Bill right away when I finish talking to you. He gave me some answers to give you about your questions yesterday evening. Great. The answers are that Mr. and Mrs. Young, who own Sparrowgrass, are frequent and welcome visitors to England, and are entertained by the Jockey Club at many race meetings. They were friends of Ezra Gideon. Val Catto doesn't know if they know that Ezra Gideon sold 2 horses to Mr. J.A. Filmer. Does that make sense? Yes, I said. Well, I'm glad you understand what I'm talking about. How about this one, then? She paused for breath. Sheridan Larrimore was sent down, expelled, from Cambridge University last May, amid some sort of hushed-up scandal. Mercer Larrimore was over in England at that time and stayed and went racing at Newmarket in July, but the Jockey Club found him grimmer than his usual self and understood it was something to do with his son, although he didn't say what. Val Catto is seeing what he can find out from Cambridge. That's fine, I said. Sheridan Larrimore, she said, sounding shocked. I hope it's not true. Brace yourself, I said dryly. Oh, dear. How well do you know him? I asked. Oh, hardly at all. But it does no good, does it, for one of our golden families to hit the tabloids? I loved the expression, and remembered she'd owned a magazine. It demeans the whole country, she went on. I just hope whatever it was will stay hushed up. Whatever it was? Yes, she said firmly. For his family's sake. For his mother's sake. I know Bambi Larrimore. She's a proud woman. She doesn't deserve to be disgraced by her son. I wasn't so sure about that. Didn't know to what extent she was responsible for his behaviour. But perhaps not much. Perhaps no one deserved a son like Sheridan. Perhaps people like Sheridan were born that way, as if without arms. Are you still there? Mrs. Baudelaire asked. I sure am. Bill says the Larrimore's private car got detached from the train on Sunday evening. Is that really true? There's a great fuss going on, isn't there? It's been on the television news and it's all over the papers this morning. Bill says it was apparently done by some lunatic for reasons unknown, but he wants to know if you have any information about it that he doesn't have. I told her what had happened, how Xanthi had casually nearly walked off into space. Tell Bill the quarry sat relaxed and unconcerned throughout both the incident and the inquiry held at Thunder Bay yesterday morning, and I'm certain he didn't plan the uncoupling. I think he did plan something, though, with his ally on the train. And I think Bill should see that they guard the train's horses very carefully out at the track. I'll tell him. Tell him there's a slight possibility that the horses' drinking water was tampered with on the train before it got to Thunder Bay. But I think that if it had been, the horses should have been showing distress by last night, which they weren't. I can't check them this morning. I suppose if there's anything wrong with them, Bill will know pretty soon. Anyway, I took 4 samples of the drinking water, which I will take to the races this evening. Good heavens! Tell Bill I'll get them to him somehow. They'll be in a package with his name on it. Let me write some of this down. Don't go away. There was a quiet period while she put down the receiver and wrote her notes. Then she came back on the line and faithfully repeated everything I'd told her and everything I'd asked. Is that right? She demanded at the end. Perfect, I said fervently. When in general is it a good time for me to phone you? I don't like to disturb you at bad moments. Phone any time. I'll be here. Have a good day. Stay invisible. I laughed, and she'd gone off the line before I could ask her about her health. A complimentary copy of a Winnipeg newspaper had been slipped under my sitting-room door. I picked it up and checked on what news it gave of the train. The story wasn't exactly all over the front page, but it started there with photographs of Mercer and Bambi, and continued inside with a glamorous backlit formal shot of Xanthi, which made her look a lot older than her published age, 15. I suspected, ironically, that the extra publicity given to the great transcontinental mystery race train hadn't hurt the enterprise in the least. Blame hadn't been fastened on anyone except some unknown nutter back in the wilds of Ontario. Winnipeg was full of race-going visitors who were contributing handsomely to the local economy. Winnipeg was pleased to welcome them. Don't forget, the paper prominently said, that the first of the 2 celebration of Canadian racing meetings would be held this evening, with the regular post time of 7 p.m., while the second meeting, including the running of the Jockey Club race train stakes, would be tomorrow afternoon. Post time 1:30. The afternoon had been declared a local holiday, as everyone knew, and it would be a fitting finale to the year's thoroughbred racing programme at Assiniboia Downs. Harness racing, it said in brackets, would hold the first meeting of its winter season the following Sunday. I spent most of the day mooching around Winnipeg, seeing a couple of owners once in a shop selling Eskimo sculptures, but never coming face to face with anyone who might know me. I didn't waste much time trying to see what Filmer did or where he went, because I'd quickly discovered that the Westin Hotel was sitting over an entrance to a subterranean shopping mall that stretched like a rabbit warren in all directions. Shopping in Canada had largely gone underground to defeat the climate. Filmer could go in and out of the Westin without a sniff of fresh air, and probably had. There were racetrack express buses, I found, going from the city to the Downs, so I went on one at about 6 o'clock and strolled around at ground level looking for some way of conveying to Bill Baudelaire the water samples, which were now individually wrapped inside the nondescript plastic carrier. It was made easy for me. A girl of about Xanthi's age bounced up to my side as I walked slowly along in front of the grandstand and said, "Hi, I'm Nancy. If that's for Clary Baudelaire, I'll take it up if you like." "Where is she?" I asked. "Dining with her dad up there by a window in the clubhouse." She pointed to a part of the grandstand. "He said you were bringing her some thirst quenchers, and he asked me to run down and collect them. Is that right?" "Spot on," I said appreciatively. She was pretty, with freckles, wearing a bright blue tracksuit with a white and gold studded belt. I gave her the carrier and watched her jaunty back view disappear with it into the crowds, and I was more and more sure that what she was carrying was harmless. Bill Baudelaire wouldn't be calmly eating dinner with his daughter if there were a multi-horse crisis going on over in the racecourse stables. The clubhouse, from where diners could watch the sport, took up one whole floor of the grandstand, glassed in along its whole length to preserve summer indoors. I decided not to go in there on the grounds that Tommy would not, and Tommy off-duty in Tommy's off-duty clothes was what I most definitely wanted to be at that moment. I made some Tommy-sized bets and ate very well in the literally below-stairs bar, and in general walked around, race card in hand, binoculars around neck, exactly as usual. The daylight faded almost imperceptibly into night, electricity taking over the sun's job smoothly. By 7, when the first race was run, it was under floodlighting, the jockeys' colours brilliant against the backdrop of night. There were a lot of half-familiar faces in the crowds, the enthusiastic racegoers from the train. The only one of them that I was interested in, though, was either extremely elusive or not there. All the techniques I knew of finding people were to no avail. The man with his gaunt face, grey hair, and fur-collared parka was more invisible than myself. I did see Nell. In her plain blue suit she came down from the clubhouse with 2 of the owners, who seemed to want to be near the horses at ground level. I drifted after the 3 of them to watch the runners come out for the third race, and wasn't far behind them when they walked right down to the rails to see the contest from the closest possible quarters. When it was over, the owners turned towards the stands, talking animatedly about the result, and I contrived to be where Nell would see me, with any luck, making a small waving motion with my race card. She noticed the card, noticed me with widening eyes, and in a short while detached herself from the owners and stood and waited. When, without haste, I reached her side, she gave me a sideways grin. "Aren't you one of the waiters from the train?" she said. "I sure am." "Did you find somewhere to sleep?" "Yes, thank you." "How's the Westin?" She was staying with the owners, their shepherd, their smoother of the way, their information booth. "Oh, the hotel's all right, but someone should strangle that rich, that arrogant, that insufferable Sheridan." Disgust vibrated in her voice as she suddenly let go of some clearly banked-up and held-back emotion.
He's unbearable. He's spoiling it for others. They all paid a fortune to come on this trip, and they're entitled not to be upset.
Did something happen? I asked.
Yes, at breakfast. The memory displeased her. Zack put on the next scene of the mystery, and Sheridan shouted him down 3 times. I went over to Sheridan to ask him to be quiet, and he grabbed my wrist and tried to pull me onto his lap. And I overbalanced and fell and hit the table hard where he was sitting. And I caught the cloth somehow and pulled it with me, and everything on it landed on the floor. So you can imagine the fuss. I was on my knees. There was orange juice and broken plates and food and coffee everywhere. And Sheridan was saying loudly it was my fault for being clumsy.
"And I can imagine," I said, seeing resignation more than indignation now in her face, "that Bambi Lorrimore took no notice, that Mercer hurried to help you up and apologize, and Mrs. Young inquired if you were hurt." She looked at me in amazement.
"You were there?"
"No, it just figures."
"Well, that's exactly what happened. A waiter came to deal with the mess, and while he was kneeling there, Sheridan said loudly that the waiter was sneering at him and he would get him fired."
She paused.
"And I suppose you can tell me again what happened next?"
She was teasing, but I answered, "I guess Mercer assured the waiter he wouldn't be fired, and took him aside and gave him $20. Her mouth opened.
"You were there?"
I shook my head. He gave me $20 when Sheridan shoved me the other evening.
"But that's awful." Mercer's a nice man caught in an endless dilemma. Bambi's closed her mind to it. Xanthe seeks comfort somewhere else. Nell thought it over and delivered her judgment, which was much like my own. "One day beastly Sheridan will do something his father can't pay for."
"Oh, he's a very rich man," I said.
Chapter 12. "It's nothing to do with his birthday, nor with his telephone numbers, nor addresses, past or present, nor his bank accounts, nor his national insurance."
Mrs. Baudelaire's light voice in my ear, passing on the bad news on Wednesday morning.
"Val Catto is working on your quarry's credit card numbers now," she said. "And he wants to know why he's doing all this research. He says he's looking up your quarry's divorced wife's personal numbers also, and he can't see 151 anywhere, with or without 3 unknown digits in front."
I sighed audibly, disappointed.
"How important is it?"
she asked. It's impossible to tell. It could be pointless. It could solve all our problems. Empty box or jackpot, or anywhere in between. Please, would you tell the Brigadier that 151 is the combination that unlocks the right-hand latch of a black crocodile briefcase? We have 3 unknowns on the left.
"Good gracious," she said.
Could you say I would appreciate his instructions?
"I could, young man. Why don't you just steal the briefcase and take your time?"
I laughed. I've thought of that, but I'd better not. Or not yet, anyway. If the numbers have any logic, this way is safest.
Val would presumably prefer you didn't get arrested.
Or murdered, perhaps, I thought. I would say, I agreed, that getting myself arrested would lose me my job.
You'd no longer be invisible.
Quite right.
And I'm afraid, she said, that I have some more negative news for you.
What is it? I asked.
Bill says the samples of water you sent him were just that, water.
Ah, that's good news, actually.
Oh, well, good then.
I reflected. I think I'll phone you again this evening before we leave Winnipeg.
Yes, do, she agreed. The further west you go, the bigger the time change, and the longer it takes to get replies from Val Catto.
Mm-hmm. Mrs. Baudelaire couldn't ring the Brigadier in the middle of his night, nor in the middle of hers. Toronto, where she lived, was 5 hours behind London, Winnipeg 6, Vancouver 8. At breakfast time in Vancouver, London's office workers began travelling home. Confusing for carrier pigeons.
Good luck, she said. I'll talk to you later.
I was used by now to her abrupt disappearances. I put my receiver down, hearing only silence on the line, and wondered what she looked like, and how deeply she was ill. I would go back to Toronto, I thought, and see her. I sped again on the bus to the races and found that overnight Assiniboia Downs had sprouted all the ballyhoo of Woodbine. T-shirt stalls, banners and besashed bosoms support Canadian racing included. I again spent most of the afternoon looking for Gauntface, coming in the end to the conclusion that whatever he was doing on the train, he wasn't travelling because of an overpowering interest in racing. The racegoers from the train were on the whole easily identifiable, as they all seemed to have been issued with large red and white rosettes, with race-train passenger emblazoned on them in gold. And the rosettes proved not to be confined to those in the front half of the train, because I came across Zack wearing one too, and he told me that everyone had been given one, the owners included, and where was mine? I didn't know about them, I said. Too bad, he said, because they entitled everyone to free entry, free race cards, and free food. They were gifts from the racecourse, he said. Nell should have one for me, he thought. I asked him how the scene from the mystery had fared that morning, as Nell had described what had happened the day before. Oh, a lot better without that bastard Sheridan. And wasn't he there? I got Nell to tell his father that if Sheridan came to breakfast, we wouldn't be putting on our scene. And it did the trick. No Sheridan. He grinned. No Larimores at all, in fact. He looked around. But they're all here, Sheridan included. They were getting out of a stretch limo when we rolled up in our private bus. That's where we were given these rosettes, on the bus. How did you get here, then? On a public bus. Too bad. His batteries were running at half speed, neither highly charged up nor flat. Under the mop of curls, his face, without the emphasizing make-up he wore perpetually on the train, looked younger and more ordinary. It was David Flynn who was at the races, not Zack. Are all the actors here? I asked. Oh, sure. We have to know what happens here today. Have to be able to talk about it to the owners tonight. Don't forget, it's a racing mystery after all. I thought that I had forgotten, in a way. The real mystery that I was engaged in tended to crowd the fiction out. What are you betting on in our race? He asked. I suppose Premier will win. What do you think? Up a gum tree, I said. It's supposed to be half asleep, he objected. It's got a nice face, I said. He looked at me sideways. You're crazy, you know that? I am but mad north-northwest. When the wind is southerly, he said promptly. I know a hawk from a handsaw. He laughed. There isn't an actor born who doesn't hope to play Hamlet. Have you ever? Only in school, but once learned, never forgotten. Shall I give you my to be or not to be? No. Ah, you slay me. I see you tonight. He went off with a medium spring to his step, and I saw him later with his arms round Donna's shoulders, which wasn't, as far as I knew, in his script. Most of the owners came down from the clubhouse to watch the saddling of the runners in the Jockey Club race train stakes, and all the sportier of them wore the rosettes. Filmer didn't. There was no light-heartedness in him. Daffodil, however, had fastened hers to her cleavage, the red, white, and gold popping out now and again past the long-haired chinchillas. Mrs. Young wore hers boldly on her lapel. Mr. Young's wasn't in sight. The Unwins, rosetted, were showing uninhibited pleasure in Upper Gumtree, who did in fact have a nice face, and wasn't unacceptably sleepy. Upper Gumtree's trainer hadn't made the journey from Australia, and nor had his usual jockey. Canadian substitutes had been found. The Unwins beamed and patted everyone within reach, including the horse, and Mr. Unwin, in his great Antipodean accent, could be heard calling his jockey son, even though the rider looked older by far than the owner. In the next stall along, things were a great deal quieter. Mercer Lorrimore, unattended by the rest of his family, talked pleasantly with his trainer, who had come from Toronto, and shook hands with his jockey, the same one who had ridden for him at Woodbine. Premier, the favourite, behaved like a horse that had had a fuss made of him all his life, almost, I thought fancifully, as arrogantly as Sheridan. The owners of Flocati were showing Mavis and Walter Bricknell-type behaviour, fluttering about in a nervous anxiety that would be bound to affect the horse if it went on too long. Their ineffective-looking trainer was trying to stop the owners from straightening the number cloth, tidying the forelock over the headband, tweaking at the saddle, and shoving their big rosettes with every ill-judged movement near the horse's affronted nostrils. A riot, really. Poor Mr. and Mrs. Flocati. Owning the horse looked an agony, not a joy. Mr. and Mrs. Young, like Mercer Lorrimore, had shipped their Winnipeg runners, 2 of them, by road. They, old hands at the owning game, stood by with calm interest, while their pair, Soluble and Slipper Club, were readied, Mrs. Young speaking with her sweet expression to one of the jockeys, Mr. Young more impassively to the other. Daffodil Quentin's runner, Pampering, had been flown in with 5 others owned by people on the train, all of whom were strolling around with rosettes and almost permanently smiling faces. This was, after all, one of the highlights of their journey, the purpose behind the bazaars. I learnt that the Manitoba Racing Commission had moreover by mid-afternoon given each of them not only a champagne reception and a splendid lunch, but also, as a memento, a framed group photograph of all the owners on the trip. They were living their memories, I thought, here and now. Television cameras all over the place recorded everything, both for news items that evening and for the 2-hour Support Canadian Racing programme, which posters everywhere announced was being made for a gala showing coast to coast after the triple had been completed in Vancouver. The Winnipeg runners went out onto the track to bugle fanfares and cheers from the stands, and were pony-escorted to the starting gate. Mercer Lorrimer's colours, red and white like the rosette he had pinned on gamely for the sake of Canadian racing, could be seen entering the outermost stall. Daffodil's pale blue and dark green were innermost. Upper Gumtree, carrying orange and black, started dead centre of the 11 runners, and came out of the stalls heading a formation like an arrow. I was watching from high up, from the upper part of the grandstand above the clubhouse floor to which the owners had returned in a chattering flock to watch the race. Through my binoculars camera, the colours down on the track in the chilly sunshine looked sharp and bright, the race easy on that account to read. The arrow formation soon broke up into a ragged line, with Premier on the outside, Pampering on the inner, and Upper Gumtree still just in front. The Youngs' pair, split by the draw, nevertheless came together and raced the whole way side by side like twins. Flocati, in pink, made for the rails as if needing them to steer by, and 4 of the other runners boxed him in. Going past the stands for the first time, the Unwin's Upper Gumtree still showed in front, but with Premier almost alongside. Pampering was on the inside, tugging his jockey's arms out. Doing their best for the glory of Canada, the whole field of 11 swept round the bend and went down the far side as if welded together, and it still seemed when they turned for home that was how they might finish, in a knot. They split apart in the straight, one group swinging wide, the red and white of Premier spurting forward with the Youngs' pair at his quarters, and Upper Gumtree swerving dramatically through a gap to take the rails well ahead of Pampering. The crowd bounced up and down. The money was on Premier. The yelling could have been heard in Montreal. The Canadian racing authorities were again getting a rip-roaring brilliant finish to a race-train stakes, and Mercer, putting his brave face on it, again came in second. It was the Unwins, in the stratosphere of ecstasy, who led Upper Gumtree into the winner's circle. The Unwins from Australia, who were hugging and kissing everyone near enough, including the horse. The Unwins, who had their photographs taken each side of their panting winner, now covered across the shoulders by a long, triumphant blanket of flowers. The Unwins who received the trophy, the cheque, and the speeches from the president of the racecourse and the top brass of the jockey club, whose memories of the day would be the sweetest. Feeling pleased for them, I lowered the binoculars through which I had been able to see even the tears on Mrs. Unwin's cheeks, and there below me and in front of the grandstand was the man with the gaunt face, looking up towards the clubhouse windows. Almost trembling with haste, I put the binoculars up again, found him, activated the automatic focus, pressed the button, heard the quiet click of the shutter, had him in the bag. It had been my only chance. Even before the film had wound on, he'd looked down and away, so that I could see only his forehead and his grey hair, and within 2 seconds he'd walked towards the grandstand and out of my line of vision. I had no idea how long he'd been standing there. I'd been too diverted by the Unwin's rejoicing. I went down from the upper grandstand as fast as I could, which was far too slowly because everyone else was doing the same thing. Down on ground level again, I couldn't see Gauntface anywhere. The whole crowd was on the move. One could get no length of view. The race train event had been the climax of the programme, and although there was one more race on the card, no one seemed to be much interested. A great many red and white rosettes, baseball caps, T-shirts and balloons were on their way out of the gates. The Unwin's entourage was disappearing into the clubhouse entrance, no doubt for more champagne and press interviews, and probably all the other owners would be in there with them. If Gauntface had been looking up at the clubroom windows in the hope of seeing Filmer, or of Filmer seeing him, maybe Filmer would come down to talk to him, and maybe I could photograph them both together, which might one day prove useful. If I simply waited, it might happen. I simply waited. Filmer did eventually come down, but with Daffodil. They weren't approached by Gauntface. They climbed into their chauffeured car and were whisked away to heaven knew where, and I thought frustratedly about time and the little of it there was left in Winnipeg. It was already nearly 6 o'clock, and I wouldn't be able to find a 1-hour photo lab open anywhere that evening, and I had to return to the Sheraton to collect my bag and be back on the train by 7:30 or soon after. I retreated to the men's room and took the film out of the binoculars camera and wrote a short note to go with it. Then I twisted the film and note together into a paper towel and went out to try to find Bill Baudelaire, reckoning it might be all right to speak to him casually down on ground level, since Filmer wasn't there to see. I'd caught sight of him in the distance from time to time all afternoon, but now, when I wanted him, his red hair wasn't anywhere around. Zack came up to me with Donna and offered me a lift back to the city in their bus, and at that exact moment I saw not Bill Baudelaire himself, but someone who might go among the owners where Tommy couldn't. "When does the bus go?" I asked Zack rapidly, preparing to leave him. 20 minutes, out front. It's got a banner on. I'll come, thanks." I covered a good deal of ground rapidly, but not running, and caught up with the shapely back view of a dark-haired girl in a red coat, with a wide gold and white studded belt. "Nancy?" I said from behind her. She turned, surprised, and looked at me inquiringly. I said. "Yesterday you collected some thirst quenchers from me for Bill Baudelaire's daughter." "Oh, yes." She recognized me belatedly. "Do you happen to know where I could find him now?" "He's up in the clubhouse drinking with the winners." Could you possibly deliver something else to him?" She wrinkled her freckled teenage nose. "I just came down for some fresh air." She sighed. "Oh, all right. I guess he'd want me to if you asked. You seem to be okay with him. What do you want me to give him this time?" I passed over the paper towel bundle. "Instructions?" she asked. "There's a note inside." "Real cloak and dagger goings-on." "Thanks, truly, and, give it to him quietly." "What's in it?" she asked. "A film, with photos of today's events." She didn't know whether or not to be disappointed. "Don't lose it," I said. She seemed to be more pleased with that, and flashing me a grin from over her shoulder, went off towards the clubhouse entrance. I hoped she wouldn't make a big production out of the delivery upstairs, but just in case she did, I thought I wouldn't go anywhere where she could see me and point me out to any of the owners. So I left through the front exit gates and found the actor's bus with its mystery race train banner and faded inside into the reassembling troupe. In general, the cast had backed premiere. What else? But were contented to have been interviewed on television at some length. A lot of Winnipeg's race crowd, Zack said, had asked how they could get on the train. "Ah, I must say," he said, yawning, "with all the publicity it's had, it's really caught on." In the publicity and the success, I thought, lay the danger. The more the eyes of Canada and Australia and England were directed to the train, the more Filmer might want to discredit it. Might. I was guarding a moving shadow, trying to prevent something that might not happen, searching for the intention so as to stop it occurring. The bus letting me off at a convenient corner in the city, I walked to the Sheraton, and from a telephone there spoke to Mrs. Baudelaire. "Bill called me 10 minutes ago from the track," she said. "He said you sent him a film,
and you didn't say where you wanted the pictures sent."
"Is he calling you back?" I asked.
"Yes, I told him I'd be speaking to you soon."
"Right. Well, there's only one picture on the film. The rest is blank. Please tell Bill the man in the photo is the ally of our quarry. His ally on the train. Would you ask if Bill knows him? Ask if anyone knows him. And if there's something about him that would be useful, if I knew, please will he tell you to tell me."
"Heavens," she said. "Let me get that straight."
She paused, writing.
"Basically, who is he, what does he do, and is what he does likely to be of help?"
"Yes," I said.
"And do you want a copy of the photo?"
"Yes, please. Ask if there's any chance of his getting it to Nell Richmond at Chateau Lake Louise by tomorrow night or the next morning."
"Difficult," she commented. "The mail is impossible."
"Well, someone might be flying to Calgary tomorrow morning," I suggested. "They might even meet our train there. We get there at 12:40, leave at 1:30. I suppose the time's too tight, but if it's possible, get Bill to address the envelope to the conductor of the train, George Burley. I'll tell George it might come."
"Dear young man," she said, "let me write it all down."
I waited while she did it.
"Now let me check," she said. "Either George Burley on the train, or Nell Richmond at Chateau Lake Louise?"
"Right. I'll call you soon."
"Don't go," she said. "I have a message for you from Val Cato."
"Oh, good."
"He said," now these are his exact words, "stolen evidence cannot be used in court, but facts learned can be verified."
The understanding amusement was light in her voice.
"What he means is, have a look-see, but hands off."
"Yes."
"And he said to tell you to remember his motto."
"Okay," I said.
"What is his motto?" she asked curiously, obviously longing to know.
"Thought before action, if you have time."
"Nice," she said, pleased. "He said to tell you he was working hard on the unknown numbers, and you are not to put yourself in danger of arrest."
"All right."
"Phone me from Calgary tomorrow," she said. "By then it'll be evening in England. Val will have had a whole day on the numbers."
"You're marvellous."
"And I'll be able to tell you when you'll get your photos."
There was a click and she'd gone, and I could hardly believe that I'd ever doubted her as a relay post. The train had come in from the sidings and stood in the station, warm and pulsing, its engines reattached, the horses and grooms on board, and fresh foods and ice loaded. It was like going back to an old friend, familiar and almost cosy. I changed into Tommy's uniform in my roomette, and went along to the dining car where Emile, Oliver and Cathy welcomed me casually as if I were an accepted part of the crew. We began immediately laying the pink cloths and putting fresh flowers in the vases, and Angus, in his tall white hat, whistling Speed Bonnie Boat amid clouds of steam, addressed his talents to wild rice and scallops in Parmesan sauce, while Simon rather grimly chopped lettuce. The passengers returned well before 8 o'clock in very good spirits, Mercer bringing with him a porter wheeling a case of highly superior bubbles for toasting the Unwin's success. The Unwins themselves, and it was impossible for anyone to grudge them their moment, said over and over again that it was great, just great, that one of the horses actually on the train had won one of the races. It made the whole thing worthwhile, and the whole party, drifting into the dining car in true party mood, agreed and applauded. Filmer, I was interested to see as I distributed glasses, was smiling pleasantly in all directions, when the last thing he probably wanted was the enormous smash hit the train enterprise was proving. Daffodil had changed into a sparkling crimson dress, and showed no pique over pampering finishing fifth. She was being friendly, as usual, to Bambi, frostier, in pale turquoise with pearls. Mercer came to Emile, and worried that the wine wasn't cold enough, but Emile assured him he had lodged all 12 bottles among the many plastic bags of ice cubes. By the time the train left the station, all would be well. The Youngs, whose slipper club had finished third, were embraced by the hyper-joyous Unwins, and were invited to their table, leaving the poor Flocartis to seek solace with others whose hopes had died on the last bend. Sheridan Lorrimore was telling a long-suffering, good-natured couple all about his prowess at ice hockey, and Xanthe, pouting and put out at having been temporarily deserted by Mrs. Young, had ended up next to Giles the murderer, whose real-life preference, I'd gathered, was for boys. The train slid out of Winnipeg on time, at 8:20, and I put all my energies and attention into being an unexceptional and adequate waiter, even though always conscious of the ominous presence in the aisle seat, facing forward, 3 tables back from the kitchen end. I never met his eyes, and I don't think he noticed me much. But we were all, Emile, Oliver, Cathy, and I, becoming slowly and inevitably more recognizable to the passengers. Several of them inquired if we'd been to the races. We all had. And had backed the winner? No, we hadn't. Fortunately, Mercer himself had had this conversation with Emile, which meant he felt no need to ask me also. So I escaped having to speak too much in my English accent at his table. The party atmosphere went on all through dinner, prevailed through a short scene put on by Zack to explain that the Mountie had been left behind in Winnipeg for investigations on the ground, and heated up thoroughly afterwards with more unsteady dancing and laughter in the dome car. Nell wandered about looking slightly less starchy, in a fuller-cut black skirt, with her tailored white silk blouse, telling me in passing that Cumber and Rose wanted to give a similar party at Chateau Lake Louise. "Who?" I said. "Cumber and Rose, Mr. and Mrs. Young." "Oh." "I spent most of the day with them." She smiled briefly and went on her way. No clipboard, I noticed. Cumber and Rose, I thought, collecting ashtrays. Well, well. Rose suited Mrs. Young fine. Cumber was appropriate also, I supposed, though Mr. Young wasn't cumbersome. Perhaps a shade heavy in personality, but not big, not awkward. Mercer and Bambi again invited Filmer and Daffodil into their private car, although it was Oliver this time who obliged them with a bowl of ice. Mercer came back after a while to collect the Unwins and the Youngs, and the general jollifications everywhere wore on without any alarms. After midnight, Nell said she was going to bed, and I walked up the train with her to her roomette, almost opposite mine. She paused in the doorway. "It's all going well, don't you think?" she said. "Terrific. I meant it. You've worked very hard." We looked at each other, she in executive black and white, I in my yellow waistcoat. "What are you, really?" she said. 29. Her lips twitched. "One day I'll crack your defenses." "Yours are half down." "What do you mean?" I made a hugging movement across my own chest. "No clipboard," I said. "Oh, well, I didn't need it this evening." She wasn't exactly confused. Her eyes were laughing. "You can't," she said. "Can't what?" "Kiss me." I'd wanted to. She'd seen it unerringly. "If you come into my parlour, I can," I said. She shook her head, smiling. "I am not going to lose my credibility on this train by being caught coming out of the help's bedroom." "Talking in the corridor is almost as bad." "Yes, it is," she said, nodding. "So good night." I said, with regret, "Good night." And she went abruptly into her own domain and closed the door. With a sigh, I went on a few steps further to George's office, and found him, as I'd expected, fully dressed, lightly napping, with worked-on forms pushed to one side beside an empty coffee cup. "Come in," he said, fully alert in an instant. "Sit down. How's it going?" "Well, so far so good." I sat on the facilities, and told him that the water samples from the horse car had been pure and simple H2O. "All that'll please the Dragon Lady, eh?" he said. "Did you go to the races?" I asked. "No, I've got family in Winnipeg. I went visiting. And I slept most of today, as I'll be up all night with the stops." He knew, however, that Upper Gumtree had won. "You should see the party going on in the forward dome car. Oh. All the grooms are drunk. The Dragon Lady's in a sober tizzy, eh? Because they tried to give a bucket of beer to the horse. They're singing
gold rush songs at the tops of their voices in the day-nighter, and it's a wonder they haven't all rocked the train right off the rails with the noise and the booze.
I guess it wouldn't be easy to rock the train off the rails, I said thoughtfully.
Easy? George said. Well, of course it is. You go too fast round the curves.
Well, suppose it was one of the passengers who wanted to stop the train getting happily to Vancouver. What could he do? He looked at me with bright eyes, unperplexed.
Besides doping the horses' water, do what they're doing in the Mystery, I'd say. Throw a body off the train, eh? That'd stop the parties pretty quick.
He chuckled.
You could throw someone off the Stony Creek Bridge. That's a high curved bridge over Rogers Pass. It's a long way down into the gulch, 300 feet and a bit more. If the fall didn't kill him, the bears would.
Bears? I exclaimed. He beamed.
Grizzly bears, eh? The Rocky Mountains aren't anyone's tame backyard. They're raw in nature. So are the bears. They kill people, no trouble.
He put his head on one side.
Or you could throw someone out into the Connaught Tunnel. That tunnel's 5 miles long, with no lights. There's a species of blind mice that live in there, eating the grain that falls from the grain trains.
Jolly, I said.
There's a wine storage under the floor of your dining car, he said with growing relish. They decided not to use it on this trip because opening it might disrupt the passengers. It's big enough to hide a body in.
His imagination, I saw, was of a scarier dimension than my own. Hiding a body in the wine store, I said politely, might indeed disrupt the passengers. He laughed.
Or how about someone alive and tied up in there, writhing in agony?
Shouting his head off?
Gagged.
If we miss anyone, I promised, that's where we'll look. I stood up and prepared to go. Where exactly is the Stony Creek Bridge? I asked, pausing in the doorway. Over Rogers Pass? His eyes gleamed, the lower lids pouching with enjoyment.
About 100 miles further on from Lake Louise, high up in the mountains. But don't you worry, eh? You'll be going across it in the dark.
Chapter 13. Everyone survived the night, although there were a few obvious hangovers at breakfast. Outside the windows, the seemingly endless rock, lake, and conifer scenery had dramatically given way to the wide-sweeping, rolling prairies. Not yellow with the grain that had already been harvested, but greenish-grey, resting before winter. There was a brief stop during breakfast at the town of Medicine Hat, which lay in a valley and looked a great deal more ordinary than its name. The passengers dutifully put back their watches when Nell told them we were now in mountain time. But where, they asked, were the mountains? This afternoon, she answered, and handed out the day's printed programme, which promised dreadful developments in the mystery at 11:30 a.m., followed by an early lunch. We would reach Calgary at 12:40, where the horse car would be detached, and leave at 1:30, heading up into the Rockies to Banff and Lake Louise. At Lake Louise, the owners would disembark and be ferried by bus to the chateau, the huge hotel sitting on the lake's shore, amid snowy scenes of breathtaking beauty. Cocktails and startling discoveries would be offered at 6:30 in a private conference room in the hotel. Have a nice day. Several people asked if we were now in front or behind the regular Canadian. We're in front, I said.
If we break down, Mr. Unwin said facetiously, it'll be along to help us out.
Xanthi, sitting next to him, didn't laugh. I wish we were behind it, she said. I'd feel safer.
Behind the Canadian there are freight trains, Mr. Unwin said reasonably. And ahead of us there are freight trains. And coming the other way there are freight trains. We're not all alone on these rails.
No, I suppose not. She seemed doubtful still, and said she had slept much better again that past night in her upper bunk than she would have done in her family's own quarters. I brought her the French toast and sausages she ordered from the menu, and filled her coffee cup, and Mr. Unwin, holding out his own cup for a refill, asked if I had backed his horse to win at Winnipeg. "I'm afraid not, sir," I said regretfully. I put his cup on the tray and poured with small movements. "But congratulations, sir." "Did you go to the races?" Xanthi asked me without too much interest. "Yes, miss," I said. I finished pouring Mr. Unwin's coffee and put it by his place, then took my tray and coffee pot along to the next table, where the conversation seemed to be about Zack's mystery rather than directly about horses. "I think the trainer killed Angelica, and the groom, too." "Well, why ever should he?" "He wants to marry Donna for her money. Angelica knew something that would make the marriage impossible, so he killed her."
"Oh, knew what?"
"Maybe that he's already married."
"To Angelica?"
"Well, why not?"
"But where does the dead groom come in?"
"He saw the murderer getting rid of the blood-spattered plastic." They laughed. I filled their cups and moved on, and poured for Daffodil, who had an empty place on her far side. Daffodil, smoking with deep-sucking lungfuls, sat with the Flocatis and nobody else. No Filmer. I glanced back along the whole dining car, but couldn't see him anywhere. He hadn't come in while I was serving others, and he hadn't been at the kitchen end when I'd started. Daffodil said to me, "Can you bring me some vodka? Ice and lemon?" "I'll ask, madam," I said, and asked Emile, and it was he who civilly explained to her that the barman wouldn't be back on duty until 11, and meanwhile everything was locked up. Daffodil received the bad news without speaking, but jabbed the fire out of her cigarette with some violent stabs and a long final grind. The Flocatis looked at her uncertainly and asked if they could help. She shook her head. She seemed angry and near to tears, but determinedly in control. "Give me some coffee," she said to me, and to the Flocatis she said, "I think I'll get off the train at Calgary. I think I'll go home." Small movements saved the day, as I would have spilled the brown liquid all over her hand. "Oh, no!" exclaimed the Flocatis, instantly distressed. "Oh, don't do that. Your horse ran splendidly yesterday, even if it was only fifth. Ours was nearly last, and we're going on. You can't give up. And you have Laurentide ice, besides, for Vancouver." Daffodil looked at them as if bemused. "It's not because of yesterday," she said. "But why, then?" Daffodil didn't tell them. Maybe wouldn't, maybe couldn't. She merely pursed her lips tight, shook her curly head, and dug out another cigarette. The Flocatis having declined more coffee, I couldn't stay to listen any further. I moved across the aisle and stretched my ears, but the Flocatis seemed to get nothing extra from Daffodil except a repeated and stronger decision to go home. Nell, in her straight grey skirt, clipboard in attendance, was still talking to passengers up by the kitchen end. I took my nearly empty coffee pot up there and made a small gesture onwards to the lobby, to where presently she came with inquiring eyebrows. Daffodil Quentin," I said, peering into the coffee pot, "is upset to the point of leaving the train. She told the Flocatis, not me, so you don't know, okay?" "Upset? About what?" Nell was alarmed. She wouldn't tell them. "Thanks," she said. "I'll see what I can do." Smoothing ruffled feelings, keeping smiles in place, all in her day's work. She started casually on her way through the dining car, and I went into the kitchen to complete my mission. By the time I was out again with a full pot, Nell had reached Daffodil and was standing by her, listening. Nell appealed to the Youngs and the Unwins at adjacent tables for help, and presently Daffodil was out of sight in a bunch of people trying to persuade her to change her mind. I had to wait quite a while to hear what was happening, but finally the whole little crowd, Daffodil among them, went out at the far end into the dome car, and Nell returned to the lobby, relaying the news to me in snatches as I paused beside her on to-and-fro journeys to clear away the breakfast debris. Cumber and Rose, the Youngs, I thought. Cumber and Rose, and also the Unwins, say there was nothing wrong last night.
They all had a splendid time in the Larimores' car. Daffodil finally said she'd had a disagreement with Mr. Filmer after the party had broken up. She said she had hardly slept and wasn't sure what to do, but there was no fun left in taking Laurentide Ice to Vancouver, and she couldn't face the rest of the journey. The Youngs had persuaded her to go up into the dome with them to think things over, but I honestly think she's serious. She's very upset. I put the last of the debris into the kitchen and excused myself apologetically from washing the dishes. "How can Mr. Filmer have upset Daffodil so much?" Nell exclaimed. "She's obviously been enjoying herself. And he's such a nice man. They were getting on together so well, everyone thought." She paused. "Mr. Unwin believes it's a lover's quarrel."
"Does he?" I pondered. I think I'll make a recce up the train, see if anything else is happening. Maybe Daffodil had made advances and been too roughly repulsed, I thought. And maybe not.
"Mr. Filmer hasn't been into breakfast," Nell said. "It's all very worrying. And last night everyone was so happy."
If Daffodil's leaving the train was the worst thing that happened, I thought, we would have got off lightly. I left Nell and set off up the corridor, coming pretty soon to Filmer's bedroom door, which was uninformatively closed. I checked with the sleeping car attendant further along the car, who was in the midst of folding up the bunks for the day and unfolding the armchairs.
"Mr. Filmer? Oh, he's in his room still, as far as I know. He was a bit short with me. He told me to hurry up, and he's not usually like that. He was eating something, and he had a thermos, too. But then we do get passengers like that sometimes. Can't get through the night without raiding the icebox, that sort of thing."
I nodded noncommittally and went onwards. But I thought that if Filmer had brought food and a thermos on board for breakfast, he must have known in Winnipeg that he would need them, which meant that last night's quarrel had been planned and hadn't been caused by Daffodil. George Burley was in his office, writing his records. "Morning," he said, beaming. "How's the train?" "The forward sleeping car attendants are threatening to resign, eh? Over the vomit in the bathrooms? Ugh." He chuckled. "I brought extra disinfectants aboard in Winnipeg," he said. "Train sickness gets them, you know." I shook my head at his indulgence and pressed forward, looking as always for Gauntface, but chiefly aiming for the horses. Leslie Brown, hollow-eyed from lack of sleep, regarded me with only half the usual belligerence.
"Come in," she said, stepping back from her door. "To be honest, I could do with some help."
As I just passed several green-looking grooms being sorry for themselves in their section, I supposed at first she meant simply physical help in tending the horses, but it appeared that she didn't.
"Something's going on that I don't understand,"
she said, locking the entrance door behind me and leading the way to the central space where her chair stood beside the innocent water tank. "What sort of thing?" I asked, following her. She mutely pointed further forward up the car, and I walked on until I came to the final space between the stalls, and there, in a sort of nest made of hay bales, one of the grooms half lay, half sat, curled like an embryo, and making small moaning noises. I went back to Leslie Brown. "What's the matter with him?" I said.
"I don't know. He was drunk last night. They all were. But this doesn't look like an ordinary hangover."
"Did you ask the others?"
She sighed. "They don't remember much about last night. They don't care what's the matter with him."
"Which horse is he with?"
"Laurentide Ice."
I'd have been surprised, I suppose, if she'd said anything else. "That's the horse, isn't it?" I asked, "whose trainer sent separate numbered individual bags of food, because another of Mrs. Quentin's horses had died because of eating the wrong things?" She nodded.
"Yes."
"And this boy was with the horse all the time in the barns at Winnipeg?"
"Yes, of course. They exercised the horses and looked after them, and they all came back to the train in horse vans yesterday after the races, while the train was still in the siding. I came with them. There's nothing wrong with any of the horses, I assure you."
"Well, that's good," I said. "Laurentide Ice as well?"
"See for yourself."
I walked round, looking at each horse, but in truth they all appeared healthy and unaffected.
even Upper Gumtree and Flocati, who would have been excused seeming thin and fatigued after their exertions. Most of them had their heads out over the stall doors, sure sign of interest. A few were a pace or two back, semi-dreaming. Laurentide Ice watched me with a bright glacial eye, in far better mental health than his attendant. I returned to Leslie Brown and asked her the groom's name. "Lenny," she said. She consulted a list. "Leonard Higgs." "How old is he?" "About 20, I should think." "What's he like, usually?" "Like the others, full of foul language and dirty jokes." She looked disapproving. "Every other word beginning with F." "When did all this moaning and retreating start?" "He was lying there all night. The other boys said it was his turn to be in here, but it wasn't really. Only he was paralytic, and they just dumped him in the hay and went back to the party. He started the moaning about an hour ago, and he won't answer me at all." She was disturbed by him and worried, I thought, that his behaviour might be held to be her responsibility. Rather to her surprise, I took off my yellow waistcoat and striped tie and gave them to her to hold. If she would sit down for a while, I suggested, I would try to sort Lenny out. Meekly for her, she agreed. I left her perching with my badges of office across her trousered knees and returned to the total collapse in the hay. "Lenny," I said, "give it a rest." He went on with the moaning, oblivious. I sat down beside him on one of the hay bales and put my mouth near his one visible ear. "Shut up," I said, very loudly. He jumped, and he gasped, and after a short pause he went back to moaning, though artificially now, it seemed to me. "If you're sick from beer," I said forcefully, "it's your own bloody fault, but I'll get you something to make you feel better." He curled into a still tighter ball, tucking his head down into his arms as if shielding it from a blow. It was a movement impossible to misconstrue. What he felt, besides alcohol sickness, was fear. Fear followed Julius Apollo Filmer like a spoor, the residue of his passing. Lenny, frightened out of his wits, was a familiar sight indeed. I undid the top buttons of my shirt, loosening the collar, and rolled up my cuffs, aiming for informality, and I slid down until I was sitting on the floor with my head on the same level as Lenny's. "If you're shit scared," I said distinctly, "I can do something about that, too." Nothing much happened. He moaned a couple of times and fell silent. And after a long while I said, "Do you want help, or don't you? This is a good offer. If you don't take it, whatever you're afraid of will probably happen." After a lengthy pause, he rolled his head round, still wrapped in his arms, until I could see his face. He was red-eyed, bony, unshaven and drivelling, and what came out of his slack mouth wasn't a groan but a croak. "Who the bloody hell are you?" He had an English accent, and a habitual pugnacity of speech altogether at odds with his present state. "Your bit of good luck," I said calmly. "Oh, piss off," he said. "Right." I got to my feet. "Too bad," I said. "Go on feeling sorry for yourself and see where it gets you." I walked away from him out of his sight. "Here," he said, croaking, making it sound like an order. I stayed where I was. "Wait," he said urgently. I did wait, but I didn't go back to him. I heard the hay rustling, and then a real groan as the hangover hit him. And finally he came staggering into view, keeping his balance with both hands on the green outside of Flocati's stall. He stopped when he saw me, blinking, swaying, the race-train T-shirt torn and filthy. He looked stupid, pathetic, and spineless. "Go back and sit down," I said neutrally. "I'll bring you something." He sagged against the green stall, but finally turned round and shuffled back the way he'd come. I went down to Leslie Brown and asked if she had any aspirins. "Not aspirins, but these," she said, proffering a box from a canvas hold-all. "These might do." I thanked her, filled a polystyrene cup with water,
and went back to see how Lenny was faring. He was sitting on the hay with his head in his hands, looking a picture of misery and a lot more normal. "Drink," I said, giving him the water, "and swallow these."
You said you could help me."
"Yes. Take the pills for a start." He was accustomed, on the whole, to doing what he was told, and he must have been reasonably good at his job, I suppose, to have been sent across Canada with Laurentide ice. He swallowed the pills and drank the water, and not surprisingly they made no immediate difference to his physical woes.
I want to get out of here,"
he said with a spurt of futile violence.
"Off this bleeding train. Off this whole effing trip. And I've got no money. I lost it. It's gone."
"All right," I said. "I can get you off."
"Straight up?"
He was surprised. "Straight up."
"When?"
"At Calgary, in a couple of hours. You can leave then." "Where do you want to go?" He stared.
"You're having me on," he said.
"No, I'll get you taken care of, and I'll see you get a ticket to wherever you want." The dawning hope in his face became clouded with confusion.
"What about old Icy?" he said. "Who'll look after him?"
It was the first thought he'd had which hadn't been raw self-pity, and I felt the first flicker of compassion. "We'll get another groom for old Icy," I promised. "Calgary's full of horse people." It wasn't exactly true. The Calgary I'd known had been one of the 6 biggest cities in Canada, half the size of Montreal, and on a population par with central Toronto. Time might have changed the statistics slightly, but probably not much. Calgary was no dusty Old West cattle town, but a skyscrapered modern city set like a glittering oasis in the skirts of the prairies. And the Stampede, in which one July I'd worked as a bronco rider, was a highly organized 10-day rodeo, with a stadium, adjacent art and stage shows, and all the paraphernalia and razzmatazz of big-time tourist entertainment. But Calgary, even in October, definitely had enough horse people around to provide a groom for Laurentide ice. I watched Lenny Higgs decide to jettison his horse, his job, and his unbearable present. Fearful that I would bungle the whole business because I'd never before actually tried this sort of unscrambling myself, I strove to remember John Millington's stated methods with people like the chambermaid at Newmarket. Offer protection, make any promise that might get results, hold out carrots, be supportive, ask for help. Ask for help. "Could you tell me why you don't want to go on to Vancouver?" I said. I made the question sound very casual, but it threw him back into overall panic, even if not into fetal position.
"No."
He shivered with intense alarm.
"Piss off. It's none of your effing business."
Without fuss, I withdrew from him again, but this time I went further away, beyond Leslie Brown, right down to the exit door. "Stay there," I said to her, passing. "Don't say anything to him, will you?" She shook her head, folding her thin arms over my waistcoat and across her chest. The dragon, I thought fleetingly, with the fire in abeyance.
"Here!"
Lenny shouted behind me.
"Come back!"
I didn't turn round. He wailed despairingly at the top of his voice.
"I want to get off this train!"
It was, I thought, a serious cry for help. I went back, slowly. He was standing between Flocati's stall and Sparrowgrass's, swaying unsteadily, watching me with haggard eyes. When I was near him, I said simply, "Why?"
"He'll kill me if I tell you."
"That's rubbish," I said.
"It isn't."
His voice was high.
"He said I'd effing die."
"Who said?"
"Him."
He was trembling. The threat had been of sufficient power for him to believe it. "Who is him?" I asked. "One of the owners?" He looked blank, as if I were talking gibberish. "Who is him?" I asked again.
Some bloke. I never saw him before."
"Look," I said calmingly, "let's go back, sit on the hay,
And you tell me why he said he'd kill you. I pointed over his shoulders towards the bales, and with a sort of exhausted compliance, he stumbled that way and flopped into a huddled mess. How did he frighten you? I asked.
He came to the barns, asked for me.
Asked for you by name? He nodded glumly. When was this?
Yesterday,
he said hoarsely.
During the races.
Go on.
He said he knew all about old Icy's food being in numbered bags.
Lenny sounded aggrieved.
Well, it wasn't a secret, was it?
No, I said.
He said he knew. Why? Because Mrs. Quentin's other horse died.
Then he stopped and looked as if an abyss had opened before him.
He started saying I done it.
Done what? Lenny was silent. Said you'd poisoned Mrs. Quentin's other horse? I suggested.
I never did it. I didn't.
He was deeply agitated.
I never.
But this man said you did?
He said I would go to jail for it. And they do bad things to boys like you in jail, he said.
He shivered.
I know they do. And he said, do you want AIDS? Because you'll get it in jail, a pretty boy like you.
Pretty, at that moment, he did not look. So, what next? I prompted.
Well, I...
He gulped.
I said I never did it. It wasn't me. And he went on saying I'd go to jail and get AIDS, and he went on, and I told him.
Told him? What?
She's a nice lady, he wailed. I didn't want to. He made me.
Was it Mrs. Quentin, I asked carefully, who poisoned her horse? He said miserably,
Yes. No. She gave me this bag of treats. That's what she said they were, treats. And to give them to her horse when no one was looking. See, I didn't look after that horse of hers. It was another groom, so I gave her horse the bag of treats, private-like, and it got colic and blew up and died. Well, I asked her after. I was that scared. But she said it was all dreadful. She'd no idea a darling horse would get colic, and let's not say anything about it, she said. And she gave me $100, and I didn't. Well, I didn't want to be blamed, see?
I did see. I said, So, when you told this man about the treats, what did he say? Lenny looked shattered.
He grinned like a shark, all teeth. And he says, if I say anything about him to anybody, he'll see I get.
He finished in a whisper.
AIDS.
I sighed. Is that how he threatened to kill you? He nodded weakly, as if spent. What did he look like? I asked.
Like my dad. He paused. I hated my dad.
Did he sound like your dad? I asked. He shook his head.
He wasn't a Brit.
Canadian?
Or American?
Well, I said, running out of questions, I'll see you don't get AIDS. I thought things over. Stay in the car until we get to Calgary. Miss Brown will get one of the other grooms to bring your bag here. The horse car is going to be unhitched from the train, and the horses are going by motor van to some stables for 2 days. All the grooms are going with them, as I expect you know. You go with the other grooms, and don't worry. Someone will come to find you and take you away, and bring another groom for Icy. I paused to see if he understood, but it seemed he did. Where do you want to go to from Calgary?
I don't know,
he said dully.
I have to think.
All right. When the someone comes for you, tell him then what you want to do. He looked at me with a sort of wonderment.
Why are you bothering?
He asked. I don't like frighteners. He shuddered.
My dad frightened the living daylights out of people. And me and Mum. And someone stabbed him, killed him, served him right.
He paused.
No one ever helped the people he frightened.
He paused again, struggling for the unaccustomed word, and came up with it.
Thanks.
With tie and buttons all correctly fastened, Tommy went back to the dining car. Zack was just finishing a scene in which old Ben, the groom who had been importuning Raoul for money on Toronto station, had been brought in from the racegoers part of the train to give damning, false, evidence against Raoul for having doped the Bricknell's horses, a charge flatly denied by Raoul, who contrived to look virtuous and possibly guilty both at the same time. Sympathy, on the whole, ended on Raoul's side, because of Ben's whining nastiness, and Zack told everyone that a most important witness would be coming to Chateau Lake Louise that evening to give damaging testimony. Against whom? Some people asked. Ah, said Zack mysteriously, vanishing towards the corridor. Only time would tell. Emile, Oliver, Cathy, and I set the tables for lunch and served its 3 courses. Filmer didn't materialize, but Daffodil did, still shaken and angry as at breakfast. Her suitcase was packed, it appeared, and she was adamant about leaving the party at Calgary. No one, it seemed, had been able to find out from her exactly what the matter was, and the lover's tiff explanation had gained ground. I served wine carefully and listened, but it was the appealing prospect of 2 days in the mountains rather than Daffodil's troubles that filled most of the minds. When Calgary appeared, like sharp white needles on the prairie horizon, and everyone began pointing excitedly, I told Emile I would do my best to return for the dishwashing, and sloped off up the train to George's office. Would the credit card telephone work in Calgary? Yes, it would. He waved me towards it as the train slowed, and told me I'd got 50 minutes. He himself, as usual, would be outside, supervising. I got through to Mrs. Baudelaire, who sounded carefree and 16.
Your photograph is on its way,
she said without preamble.
But it won't get to Calgary in time. Someone will be driving from Calgary to Chateau Lake Louise later this afternoon, and they're going to take it to your Miss Richmond.
That's great, I said. Thank you.
But I'm afraid there's been no word from Val Cato about your numbers.
Well, can't be helped.
Anything else?
She asked. Yes, I said. I need to talk to Bill direct.
Oh, what a shame. I've been enjoying this.
Oh, I said, please, so have I. It's only that it's more than a message and question and answer. It's long and complicated.
My dear young man, don't apologize. Bill was still in Winnipeg 10 minutes ago. I'll call him straight away. Do you have a number?
Yes. I read her the number on the train's handset. The sooner the better. Would you tell him?
Talk to you later,
she said, and went away. I waited restlessly through 10 wasted minutes before the phone rang. Bill's deep voice reverberated in my ear. Where are you? On the train in Calgary Station. My mother says it's urgent. Yes, but chiefly because this cellular telephone is in the conductor's office and only works in cities. Understood, he said. Fire away. I told him about Daffodil's departure and Lenny Higgs's frightened collapse, about what she had not said and he had. Bill Baudelaire at length demanded, Have I got this straight? This, Lenny Higgs said Daffodil Quentin got him to give her horse something to eat, from which the horse got colic and died? Strong supposition of cause and effect, but unprovable, I should think. Yes. They had an autopsy and couldn't find what caused the colic. It was the third of her dead horses. The insurers were very suspicious, but they had to pay.
Lenny says she told him she would never do any harm to her darling horses, but she gave him $100 to keep quiet. Bill groaned. But, I said, it might have been because she'd had 2 dead horses already, and she was afraid everyone would think exactly what they did think anyway.
I suppose so, he said. So, where are we now?
Going on past experience, I said, I would think, and this is just guessing, that after midnight last night, our quarry told Daffodil that her groom had spilled the beans, and would spill them again to order in public, and that he would see she was warned off at the very least if she didn't sell him or give him her remaining share in Laurentide ice.
He said gloomily, You all know him better than I do, but on form I think you may be right. We'll know for sure, won't we, if he applies to change the partnership registration before the Vancouver race.
I agreed. Well, if you, the Ontario Racing Commission, feel like giving Daffodil the benefit of the doubt over her horses, and of course you know her better than I do, but it seems to me she may not be intentionally wicked, but more silly. I mean, there's something immature about her for all her 50 years or so. And some people don't think it's all that wicked to defraud insurance companies. Perfectly respectable people sometimes do it. And I believe all 3 horses would have been put down sooner or later, wouldn't they? Anyway, I'm not excusing her if she's guilty, but explaining how she might feel about it.
You've got to know her remarkably well.
I've just noticed.
He said dryly. Val Cato said you noticed things.
Well, I don't know how you feel about this, but I thought that if we spirited Lenny Higgs away, sort of, he wouldn't be around to be threatened or to be a threat to Daffodil. And if you could tell her somehow that Lenny Higgs had vanished and will not be spilling any beans whatsoever, if you could square it with your conscience to do that, then she doesn't need to part with her half-share, and we will have foiled at least one of our quarry's rotten schemes. And that's my brief, isn't it? He breathed out lengthily as a whistle. I held the line and waited.
Is Lenny Higgs still on the train?
He asked eventually. Unless he panics, he's going with the other grooms and horses to their stabling here. I told him someone would come to fetch him and look after him and give him a free ticket to wherever he wants to go.
Now, hold on.
It's the least we can do. But I think we should follow it up and positively know his exact ultimate destination, even fix him up with a job, because we, in our turn, may want him to give evidence against the man who frightened him. If we do, we don't want to have to find him worldwide. And if you can send someone to help him, get them to take along a copy of the photo you've had printed for me, because I'm pretty certain that's the man who frightened him. Lenny should turn to jelly if it is. Chapter 14. There was unfortunately a fair amount of dishwashing still to do when I returned to the kitchen, so I lent a slightly guilty hand, but kept walking out with glasses and cloths into the dining car, so that I could see what was going on outside the windows. Daffodil, attended by Nell and Rose and Cumber Young, he carrying her 2 suitcases, was helped down from the dome car by station staff and went off slowly into the main part of the station. Daffodil's curls were piled as perkily high as usual, but her shoulders drooped inside the chinchillas, and the glimpse I had of her face showed a forlorn, lost child expression, rather than a virago bent on revenge. Nell was being helpful. Rose Young exuded comfort. Cumber Young looked grim. "Are you drying glasses, or are you not?" Cathy demanded. She was pretty, bright-eyed and quick, and also, at that moment, tired. "Intermittently," I said. Her momentary ill-temper dissolved. "Then get an intermittent move on, or I won't be able to go over to the station before we leave." "Right," I said, and dried and polished several glasses devotedly. Cathy giggled. "How long are you going to keep this up?" "To the end, I guess." "But when is your scene?" "Ah," I said, "that's the trouble. Right at the end. So I'll be drying dishes to Vancouver." "Are you the murderer?" she asked teasingly.
Most definitely not. Last time we had an actor pretending to be a waiter, he was the murderer. The murderer, I said, is that passenger you give the best portions to, that good-looking single man who's nice to everyone. Her eyes stretched wide. He's an owner, she said. He's an actor. And don't give him away. Oh, of course I won't. She looked slightly dreamy-eyed, though, as if I'd passed on good news. I didn't like to disillusion her about her or any girl's prospects with the gorgeous Giles. She would find out soon enough. The chores finally done, Cathy skipped away to the delights of the station, and in her place I helped Emile and Oliver stow and lock up all the equipment, as when everyone disembarked at Lake Louise, the train was again going to be standing cold and silent in sidings for 2 days before the last stretch westwards to the Pacific. Some, but not all, of the passengers had gone ashore, so to speak, at Calgary, and those who had been in the station came wandering back in good time, including the Youngs. Of Filmer there was no sign, nor of the gaunt-faced man. The dining car half filled again with people who simply preferred sitting there, and from those I heard that the horse car had been safely detached from the train and had been towed away by the engine, leaving the rest of us temporarily stranded. The regular Canadian, they told each other, which had arrived on time 35 minutes after us, was the train standing 3 tracks away, its passengers stretching their legs like our own. The Canadian, it seemed, had changed from threat to friend in the general perception, our doppelganger and companion on the journey. The passengers from both had mingled and compared notes. The conductors had met for a talk. There was a jerk and a shudder through the train as the engine returned and reattached, and soon afterwards we were on our way again, with passengers crowding now towards the dome car's observation deck to enjoy the ascent into the mountains. Filmer, slightly to my surprise, was among those going through the dining car, and right behind him came Nell, who looked over Filmer's shoulder at me and said, "I've got a message for you from George Burley." "Oh, excuse me, miss," I said abruptly, standing well back between 2 tables to let Filmer go by. "I'll be right with you." "What?" She was puzzled, but paused and stepped sideways also to let others behind her walk on through the car. Filmer himself had gone on without stopping, without paying Nell or me the least attention, and when his back was way down the car and well out of earshot of a quiet conversation, I turned back to Nell with inquiry. "It's a bit of a mix-up," she said. She was standing on the far side of the table from me and speaking across it. "Apparently, the telephone in George Burley's office was ringing when he got back on board, and it was a woman wanting to speak to a Mr. Kelsey. George Burley consulted his lists and said there was no Mr. Kelsey on board. So whoever it was asked him to give a message to me, which he did." It must have been Mrs. Baudelaire phoning, I thought. No one else knew the number. Bill himself could never be mistaken for a woman. Not his secretary, heaven forbid. "What's the message?" I asked. "I don't know if between us George Burley and I have got it right." She was frowning. "It's meaningless, but 049. That's the whole message. 049. She looked at my face. "Well, you look happy enough about it, anyway." I was also appalled, as a matter of fact, at how close Filmer had come to hearing it. I said, "Yes, well, please don't tell anyone else about the message, and please forget it if you can." "I can't." "No, I was afraid not." I hunted around, if not for explanations, at least for a reasonable meaning. "It's to do," I said, "with the border between Canada and America, with the 49th parallel." "Oh, sure." She was unsure by the look of things, but willing to let it go. I said, "Someone will bring a letter to the chateau sometime this evening addressed to you. It will have a photo in it. It's for me, from Bill Baudelaire. Will you see that I get it?" "Yes, okay." She briefly glanced at her clipboard. "I wanted to talk to you anyway about rooms." A passenger or two walked past, and she waited until they had gone. "The train crew are staying in the staff annex at Chateau Lake Louise, and the actors will be in the hotel itself. Which do you want? I have to write the list." "Our passengers will be in the hotel?" "Ours, yes, but not the racegoers. They're all getting off in Banff. That's the town before Lake Louise." The owners are all staying in the chateau. So am I. Which do you want?"
"Oh, to be with you," I said.
"Oh, seriously?"
I thought briefly. "Is there anywhere else?"
"There's a sort of village near the station, about a mile from the chateau itself, but it's just a few shops, and they're closing now at this time of the year, ready for winter. A lot of places are closed by this time in the mountains." She paused. "The chateau stands by itself on the lake shore. It's beautiful there."
"Is it big?" I asked.
"Huge."
"Okay, I'll stay there and risk it."
"Risk what?"
"Being stripped of my waistcoat."
"But you won't wear it there," she assured me.
"No, metaphorically." She lowered the clipboard and clicked her pen for writing. "Tommy Titmouse," I said. Her lips curved.
"T. Titmouse." She spelled it out. "That do?"
"Fine."
"What are you really?"
"Wait and see," I said. She gave me a dry look, but no answer, because some passengers came by with questions, and I went forward into the dome car to see how firmly Julius Apollo would appear to be seated, wondering whether it would be safe to try to look inside his briefcase, or whether I should most stringently obey the command not to risk being arrested. If he hadn't hoped I would look, the brigadier wouldn't have relayed the number, but if I looked and got caught looking, it'd blow the whole operation.
Filmer was nowhere to be seen. From the top of the staircase I searched again through the rows of backs of heads under the dome. No thick, black, well-brushed thatch with a scattering of grey hairs. Bald, blonde, tangled and trimmed, but no Filmer. He wasn't in the downstairs lounge, and he wasn't in the bar, where the poker school was, as usual, in progress, oblivious to the scenery. That left only the Lorrimores' car. He had to be with Mercer, Bambi and Sheridan. Xanthe was with Rose and Cumber Young, watching the approach of the distant white peaks under a cloudless sky. I walked irresolutely back towards Filmer's bedroom, wondering whether the disinclination I felt to enter it was merely prudence or otherwise plain fear, and being afraid it was the latter. I would have to do it, I thought, because if I didn't I'd spend too much of my life regretting it, a permanent D- in the balance sheet. By the time I left the dining room and started along the corridor past the kitchen, I was already feeling breathless, already conscious of my heart, and it was not in any way good for self-confidence. With a dry mouth, I crossed the chilly shifting join between cars, opening and closing the doors, every step bringing me nearer to the risky commitment. Filmer's was the first room in the sleeping car beyond the kitchen. I rounded the corner into the corridor with the utmost reluctance, and was just about to put my hand to the door handle when the sleeping car attendant, dressed exactly as I was, came out of his roomette at the other end of the car, saw me, waved, and started walking towards me. With craven relief I went slowly towards him, and he said, "Hi, and how was I doing?" He was the familiar one who told me about Filmer's private breakfast, who'd shown me how to fold and unfold the armchairs and bunks, the one who looked after both the car we were in and the 3 bedrooms, Daffodils among them, in the dome car. He had all afternoon and nothing to do, and was friendly and wanted to talk, and he made it impossible for me to shed him and get back to my nefarious business. He talked about Daffodil and the mess she had made of her bedroom. "Mess? If you ask me," he said, nodding, "she'd had a bottle of vodka in her suitcase. There was broken glass all over the place, broken vodka bottle, and the mirror over the wash basin, in splinters all over the place. I guess she threw the vodka bottle at the mirror and they both broke." "A bore for you to have to clear that up," I said. He seemed surprised. "I didn't clear it. It's still like that. George can take a look at it." He shrugged. "I don't know if the company will charge her for it. Shouldn't be surprised." He looked over my shoulder at someone coming into the car from the dining room. "Afternoon, sir," he said. There was no reply from behind me. I turned my head and saw Filmer's back view going into his bedroom. Dear God, I thought in horror. I would have been in there with his briefcase open, reading his papers. I felt almost sick. I sensed more than saw Filmer come out of his bedroom again and walk towards us.
"Can I help you, sir?" the sleeping-car attendant said, going past me towards him. "Yes. What do we do about our bags at Lake Louise?" "Leave it to me, sir. We're collecting everyone's cases and transporting them to the chateau. They'll be delivered to your room in the chateau, sir." "Good," Filmer said, and went back into his lair, closing the door. Beyond the merest flicker of a glance at about waist level, he hadn't looked at me at all. "We did the same with the bags at Winnipeg," the sleeping-car attendant said to me resignedly. "You'd think they'd learn." "Well, perhaps they will by Vancouver." "Yeah." I left him after a while and went and sat in my own roomette, and did some deep breathing, and thanked every guardian angel in the firmament for my deliverance, and in particular the angel in the sleeping-car attendant's yellow waistcoat. Outside the window, the promise of the mountains became an embrace. Rocky hillsides covered with tall, narrow pines, crowding down to the railway line winding through the valley of the Bow River. There were thick, untidy collections of twigs, sitting like ascot hats on the top of a good many telegraph poles, which looked quite extraordinary. One of the passengers had said the hats were osprey nests, and that the poles were made with platforms on especially to accommodate them. Brave birds, I thought, laying their eggs near to the roaring trains. Hair-raising entertainment for the hatchlings. Our speed had slowed from the brisk prairie rattle to a grunting uphill sliver, the train taking 2 hours to cover the 70 miles from Calgary to Banff. When it stopped there, in the broad part of the valley, the snow-topped peaks were suddenly revealed as standing around in a towering, glistening, uneven ring, the quintessential mountains rising in bare, majestic, rocky grandeur from the thronging, forested, courtier foothills. I felt then, as most people do, the strong lure of high, mysterious, frozen places, and Filmer or not, I found myself smiling with pleasure, light-hearted to the bone. It had been noticeably warm in Calgary, owing, it was said, to the fern winds blowing down from the mountains, but in Banff it was suitably cold. The engine huffed and puffed about and split the train in two, taking the racegoers and all the front part off to a siding and coming back to pick up just the owner's quarters, the 3 sleeping cars, the dining car, the dome car, and the Lorrimores. Abbreviated and much lighter, these remains of the train climbed at good speed for another 3/4 of an hour and triumphantly drew up beside the log cabin station of Lake Louise. With great cheerfulness the passengers disembarked, shivering even in their coats after the warmth of the cars, but full of expectation, daffodil forgotten. They filed onto a waiting bus, while their suitcases were loaded into a separate truck. I clung to a fraction of hope that Filmer would leave his briefcase to be ferried in that fashion, but when he emerged from the train, the case went with him, clutched firmly in his fist. I told Nell I would walk up the mile or so from the station, so as not to arrive until everyone had booked in and cleared the lobby. She said I could travel up anyway with the crew in their own bus, but I entrusted my bag to her keeping, and in my grey regulation raincoat, buttoned to the neck, I enjoyed the fresh, cold air and the deepening harvest gold of the late afternoon sunlight. When I reached the lobby of the Grand Chateau, it was awash with polite young Japanese couples on honeymoon, not the Unwins, the Youngs, and the Flocatis. Nell was sprawled in a lobby armchair, as if she would never be able to summon the energy to rise again, and I went and sat beside her before she'd realized I was there. "Is everyone settled?" I asked. She sighed deeply and made no attempt at moving. "The suite I had reserved for the Lorrimores has been given to someone else 1/2 an hour before we got here. The people are not budging, the management are not apologizing, and Bambi is not pleased, I can imagine. On the other hand, we are sitting with our backs to one of the greatest views on earth." I twisted round and looked over the back of the chair, and saw, between thronging Japanese, black and white mountains, a turquoise-blue lake, green pines, and an advancing glacier, all looking like painted stage scenery, awesomely close and framed by the windows. "Wow," I said, impressed. "Oh, it won't go away," Nell said after a while. "It'll all still be there tomorrow." I flopped back into the chair. "It's amazing. That's why people have been coming here to stare for generations."
I expected altogether more snow, I said. It'll be knee-deep by Christmas. Do you have any time off here? I asked. She looked at me sideways. 5 seconds now and then, but almost no privacy. I sighed lightly, having expected nothing else. She was the focus, the centre round which the tour revolved, the most visible person, her behaviour vivisected. Your room is in one of the wings, she said, handing me a card with a number on it. You just have to sign in at the desk and they'll give you the key. Your bag should be up there already. Most of the actors are in that wing, none of the owners. Are you? No. She didn't say where her room was, and I didn't ask. Where will you eat? She said doubtfully. I mean, will you sit with the actors in the dining room? I shook my head. But not with the owners. It's a lonely old life, I said. She looked at me with sudden sharp attention, and I thought ruefully that I had told her a good deal too much. Do you mean, she asked slowly, that you do this all the time? Play a part? Not just on the train? No, I smiled. I work alone, that's all I meant. She almost shivered. Are you ever yourself? Sundays and Mondays. Alone? Well, yes. Her eyes, steady and grey, looked only moderately troubled. Oh, you don't seem unhappy, she observed, being lonely. Of course not. I choose it, mostly. But not when there's an alluring alternative hiding behind a clipboard. The arm lay on her lap at that moment, off duty. She smoothed a hand over it, trying not to laugh. Tomorrow, she said, retreating into common sense, I'm escorting a busload of passengers to a glacier, then to lunch in Banff, then up a mountain in cable cars. And may it keep fine for you. The Larimores have a separate chauffeur-driven car. Has anyone else? Not since Mrs. Quentin's left. Poor old Daffodil, I said. Poor? Nell exclaimed. Did you know she smashed the mirror in her room? Yes, I heard. Is Mr. Filmer going on the bus trip? I don't know yet. He wanted to know if there's an exercise gym because he likes lifting weights. The bus is simply available for anyone who wants to go. I won't know everyone who'll be on it until we set off. I would have to watch the departure, I thought. And that could be difficult, as I would be half familiar to all of them by now, and could hardly stand around invisibly for very long. The Unwins have come down into the hall and are heading straight towards me, Nell said, looking away from me. Right. I stood up without haste, took the card she'd given me to the desk, and signed the register. Behind me I could hear the Unwins' Australian voices telling her they were going for a stroll by the shore, and it was the best trip they'd ever taken. When I turned round, holding my own key, they were letting themselves out through the glass doors to the garden. I paused again beside Nell, who was now standing up. Maybe I'll see you, I said. Maybe. I smiled at her eyes. If anything odd happens, she nodded. You're in room 662. After Vancouver, I said. What then? After the races, I'm booked straight back to Toronto on the red-eye special. What's the red-eye special? The overnight flight. So soon? How was I to know I wouldn't want to? That'll do fine, I said, for now. Don't get ideas, Nell said sedately, above your lowly station. She moved away with a mischievous glint, and I went contentedly up to the 6th floor in the wing where there were no owners, and found that the room allocated to me was near the end of the passage, and next door to Zach's. His door was wide open, with Donna and Pierre standing half in, half out. "Come on in," Donna said, seeing me. "We're just walking through tonight's scene." "And we've a hell of a crisis on our hands," Pierre said. "We need all the input we can get." "But Zach might not—" I began. He came to the door himself. "Zach is taking suggestions from chimpanzees," he said. "Okay, I'll just take off my coat." I pointed. "I'm in the room next along."